Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little detour through some of the most dangerous, chaotic and genuinely unsettling corners of early American history. I want you to imagine, if you will, that you've just stepped off a creaking stagecoach onto a muddy trail somewhere in the backwoods of 1800s America. The sun's bleeding out over the horizon, leaving everything in this amber half-light that makes it impossible to see who's coming toward you. There's no sheriff within 50 miles. There's no telegraph, no police station, no way to call for help. Just you, the darkness that's falling fast, and the very real possibility that the figure on horseback coming out of the trees has less than honourable intentions. And honestly, you probably won't survive this, but that's kind of the whole point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're watching from somewhere interesting, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're all tuning in from while you're theoretically winding down. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture the United States in 1800. Not the neat, organised nation you might imagine from your history textbooks, but a sprawling half-wild continent where the government's authority basically evaporates somewhere around the Appalachian Mountains. The eastern seaboard has courthouses and magistrates, sure, but out here on the frontier, that whole apparatus of law and order is a distant, abstract concept. And into this vacuum flows exactly what you'd expect. Murderers, thieves, con artists, and people who discovered that the absence of consequences is incredibly good for pursuing their hobbies. The frontier doesn't create criminals, understand, but it does create the conditions where criminals can absolutely thrive. There's no organised police force. Capturing a suspect means forming a posse of locals who may or may not be sober, may or may not have any actual authority, and definitely don't have any formal training in restraining someone. The distance between settlements means you could rob someone blind and be 3 days gone before anyone even reports it. And here's the genuinely dark part. Even if you are caught, the punishment might be meted out by a vigilante mob instead of an actual court, which honestly raises the question of who's really the criminal in that scenario. But we'll get to that later. The trails and waterways of early America became highways for predation, mud-slicked paths carved through dense forest where merchants travelled with goods and settlers moved their meagre possessions towards some promise of land and safety. Oil lamps flickering inside tiny way stations and taverns where rumours spread faster than accuracy could catch up. Flatboats, those massive, ungainly barges carrying goods down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, became floating treasure chests for anyone willing to stage an ambush. Imagine being the riverboat captain. You've got cargo worth a fortune, you're moving at the speed of the current, and you can't exactly manoeuvre in a hurry, you're trapped. Historians still argue whether the early frontier was actually more dangerous per capita than modern urban centres, but what's undeniable is that the danger felt more existential, more personal. When you could die from an infected cut, a poorly placed bullet, or just bad luck, the margins between civilized society and complete chaos seemed razor thin, and in that tense space, certain men thrived. Men with nothing to lose, everything to gain, and a talent for violence became the dominant predators of the American frontier. The early 1800s saw a peculiar economic reality. Legitimate money was scarce. Most transactions involved barter or scrip from employers, who paid workers in vouchers redeemable only at company stores. So if you wanted actual currency, theft became a rational economic strategy. One source of wealth that kept appearing again and again was other people's property, and most horrifyingly, other people themselves. Slave trafficking, cattle rustling, horse theft. These weren't considered petty crimes on the frontier. A horse theft could cost a settler their livelihood. A robbery could strip a merchant of everything. And the criminals who mastered these enterprises, some of them became genuinely famous or infamous, depending on perspective. The strange thing about frontier criminality is that some of these outlaws developed almost a mythology around themselves. Not quite like the Wild West legends of later decades, but close. They had names, they had territories, they had methods that were recognised and feared. But here's where I want to pause and appreciate the particular strangeness of this era. While crime was happening at a fever pitch, so was this weird intersection of moral panic and genuine justice confusion. Newspapers printed stories about criminal gangs that were probably half embellished. Settlers heard rumours and passed them on distorted. By the time a story about a gang of outlaws reached the Eastern papers, it had probably been inflated with 10 additional murders and magical properties that the original criminals definitely didn't have. Yet underneath all the embellishment, there were real threats, real violence, real reasons to travel in armed groups and keep your doors barred at night. So tonight, we're going to talk about the actual criminals, the names you can verify, the methods you can document, the genuinely creepy stuff that was happening in the shadows of American expansion. And trust me, the real history is just as unsettling as the legends. You're standing on a bank of the Ohio River sometime in the 1790s, watching a flatboat drift downstream. These boats, they're not elegant. They're basically floating wooden boxes, broad and slow and carrying everything a family or merchant owns. From your vantage point, you can see maybe 3 people aboard, and they're working the long poles to keep the boat in the channel. It's back-breaking work, and somewhere upriver, watching those same boats with an entirely different kind of focus, are the Harp brothers. Micajah, Big Harp, and Wiley, Little Harp, were not subtle men. What they were was prolific and uncontrollably violent. These weren't sophisticates who planned elaborate heists. They were sadistic killers who found the river economy a convenient venue for their particular talents. The Ohio and Mississippi rivers in the late 1700s and early 1800s carried the lifeblood of American commerce, goods heading south from Pittsburgh and up from New Orleans, settlers drifting toward Kentucky and Tennessee with their possessions in boats and carts. The Harps would set up camp, often on islands or isolated bends in the river, and wait. When a flatboat drifted within range, they'd attack. Not all of it was piracy in the organised sense. Much of it was pure opportunistic violence. The Harps were documented as having killed numerous people. The exact number remains disputed because accurate record-keeping wasn't exactly a priority in the 1790s wilderness, but credible sources suggest at least a dozen definite murders, possibly many more. Some historians have argued that the Harps might have been responsible for 40 or 50 deaths, but those numbers venture into legend territory. What made the Harps particularly notorious wasn't just the frequency of their murders, but the casual cruelty involved. There are accounts, documented in period records and court testimonies, of them killing travellers with what seemed to be absent-minded malice, as though murder was just something they did without particular emotion. No grand cause, no political motivation, no twisted logic of justice or revenge. Just killing because they could, and because the river isolation meant no one would hold them accountable until much later. They operated in the 1790s along the Ohio River, and for years the exact scope of their crimes wasn't even fully understood because isolated murders were rarely connected or even reported properly. A merchant disappears on the river, his family grieves, his cargo never arrives, and without any communication infrastructure those dots don't get connected until someone puts the pieces together much later. But the Harps, despite their reputation, were just one gang among several operating the same waters. Samuel Mason was running a similar enterprise downriver, also predating on flatboat traffic, also operating with what seemed to be a genuine psychological disregard for human life. Mason's gang would ambush boats, rob them, and if the victims were particularly unlucky, they'd be killed to prevent testimony, or just because the killers were feeling homicidal. One source claims, and this is where we venture into the quirkier footnotes of river piracy, that Mason's gang would occasionally leave calling cards at crime scenes, essentially branded attacks with Mason's name or mark attached. This was either a sign of genuine arrogance or possibly a completely fabricated legend, designed to make the crimes seem more organised and sinister than they actually were. We genuinely don't know, and historians still argue about the extent to which river pirates operated as organised criminal enterprises versus loose confederations of killers who happened to prey on the same targets. The Cave in Rock gang represents probably the most formalised version of river piracy in this era. Cave in Rock is an actual place, a massive cave in the bluffs along the Ohio River in southern Illinois. During the early 1800s, it became essentially a criminal headquarters where a gang would shelter, divide stolen goods, and maintain what you might generously call a business operation. The cave itself became famous enough that it shows up in newspapers and published accounts, which is saying something when you consider the difficulty of communication in that era. The gang would pose as friendly travellers, welcome boats and flatboats to the shelter of the cave, and once the crews were trapped inside, robbery and murder would follow. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't sophisticated, but it worked well enough that the cave maintained its reputation for violence for years. The whole river piracy phenomenon hinged on a fundamental economic reality. Flatboats were generally one-way traffic. You loaded goods, pushed off downriver, and once you reached New Orleans, you either sold the boat for scrap or tried to navigate back upstream with enormous effort and expense. Most of the time, you sold the boat and took a stagecoach back upriver or travelled by other means. This meant that captains and crew had an incentive to protect their cargo ferociously because it represented their entire economic stake. But it also meant that once you were on the river, isolated between settlements, your life was entirely at the mercy of whoever you encountered. There was no law enforcement on the water. There were no river patrols. If you met criminals, your only option was to fight or comply, and neither option guaranteed survival. The economy of river piracy was grim but straightforward. Steal cargo worth hundreds or thousands of dollars, distribute the goods through backwards trading networks where stolen merchandise was as good as legitimate goods, and repeat until you were caught or killed. By the 1820s, the river piracy phenomenon was beginning to decline, not because the legal system suddenly became effective, but because more settlements meant more witnesses, more communication between towns, and more organised militia responses. The romanticised image of the river pirate is largely a later invention. By the time Mark Twain wrote about these waters in the 1880s, actual violent river piracy was mostly a memory. But in the lived experience of people travelling the Ohio and Mississippi in the 1790s and early 1800s, it was a genuine terror. Every night you spent anchored meant a possible night where bandits emerged from the darkness. Every flatboat you saw approaching could be trouble. The sheer unpredictability of the danger, the knowledge that a peaceful river journey could turn into a death trap in seconds, created a cultural anxiety that shaped settlement patterns and commercial practices for decades. You're sitting in a tavern in Tennessee, sometime around 1835, and you overhear conversations that make your blood run cold. There's a man named John Murrell, and according to people who claim to know, he's the head of something called the Mystic Clan, a supposedly massive criminal organisation operating across multiple states with a membership in the thousands. The claims are staggering. They're supposedly stealing enslaved people, running them through underground networks and selling them downriver. They're counterfeiting money. They're running confidence schemes on a massive scale. They're operating with secret oaths and hierarchical organisation that rivals anything you'd see in an actual nation-state. And the truly unsettling part, no one can agree on whether the Mystic Clan is a real organisation or an urban legend that got blown completely out of proportion. John Murrell himself is real. That part's documented. He was arrested in 1834 and convicted of slave trafficking, specifically of attempting to help enslaved people escape with the intention of selling them to new owners further south. But the scope of his criminal enterprise, according to contemporary accounts, seems absolutely enormous. Some sources claim thousands of people were involved in his organisation. Some accounts suggest he was operating across Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi and other states, with a coordinated criminal network that predated the Civil War by decades. If even half of what was written about Murrell is accurate, he represents one of the earliest examples of organised interstate criminal activity in American history. But here's where the history gets murky. Much of what we know about Murrell's organisation comes from a book published in 1835 titled A History of the Detection, Conviction, Life and Designs of John A. Murrell, which was basically early true crime sensationalism and may have significantly embellished the actual scope of his operations. The historical fact that's completely verifiable is that slave trading, both legitimate in the South and illegal in the North, created an enormous economic incentive structure for criminal networks. Enslaved people were valuable commodities. A human being could be sold down the river, a phrase that originated from exactly this practice, being trafficked from upper South states to the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South, where life expectancy was shorter and conditions were more horrific. So the conditions existed for organised crime to emerge around this commerce. Whether Murrell actually headed a 1,000-strong organisation, or whether he ran a smaller operation that got massively mythologized, is hard to pin down. The most credible accounts suggest he was involved in a slave trafficking network, but probably a smaller operation than contemporary press reports indicated. What's genuinely fascinating and deeply unsettling about the Murrell conspiracy panic is what it reveals about how antebellum society processed criminal threats. The supposed Mystic Clan was allegedly hiding in plain sight, with secret hand signals and coded language that only initiates could understand. Supposedly, any itinerant stranger could be a member. Supposedly, entire communities could be infiltrated without anyone realizing it. This fed directly into the paranoia that was already percolating in the South around the question of slave rebellion. What if enslaved people and white criminals were working together? What if there was a shadowy network bent on destabilizing Southern society? These fears, whether grounded in anything real or largely imagined, shaped actual political and social responses. Militia companies were organized, laws were passed, travellers were viewed with increasing suspicion. Here's a quirky detail that historians often overlook. Part of Murrell's supposedly elaborate scheme involved recruiting members through taverns and frontier gathering spaces by targeting men with existing criminal records or moral questionability. The idea was that he could prey on social outcasts and offer them membership in something that felt organised and purposeful. Whether this was actually his strategy, or whether this is a narrative that got added to the legend, it reveals something important about frontier social anxiety. The people who were afraid of the Murrell conspiracy weren't mainly concerned with urban crime or professional criminal organisations. They were afraid of the organised mobilisation of marginal people, of the bottom rungs of society coordinating with each other. The Murrell conspiracy panic also reveals something about the peculiar moral confusion of antebellum America. Murrell was accused of running a slave-stealing and slave-selling operation, which sounds like it should position him alongside abolitionists. But the opposite was the case. The panic around his activities was intense, specifically in the South, where slavery was legal and enshrined in law. So the crime was framed not as kidnapping human beings, but as theft of property and organised criminal activity targeting the South. The fact that the property in question was human didn't register as the central moral issue. Instead, the disruption to Southern economic and social order became the focal point. This kind of moral inversion, where the violence of slavery can be eclipsed by panic about criminal threats to the system itself, is one of the darker features of antebellum American criminality discourse. Historians still argue about whether the Murrell conspiracy was an actual coordinated national criminal organisation, or whether it was something smaller that got massively mythologized through sensational newspaper accounts and the published semi-fictional history of his conviction. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. There was probably an organised criminal network involved in slave trafficking and other crimes, but probably not on the massive scale that was claimed. But what's important for understanding 1800s American crime is that whether the Mystic Clan was real or invented, its supposed existence shaped how people understood criminal threats and social order. The terror of hidden organisation, of enemies within, of conspiracy spreading invisibly through society, these were the narratives that defined frontier-era and antebellum criminal panic. You're standing in a muddy clearing outside a cabin somewhere in East Texas around 1840, and you're watching an impromptu trial happen. There's no judge, there's no law enforcement, there's no courthouse, no jury instructions, no formal legal mechanism of any kind. What there is maybe 50 armed men, most of them neighbours, some of them probably enemies of the accused, and a general consensus that justice needs to happen right now, today, in this clearing. Someone has accused a man of stealing horses. The accusation might be true, the accusation might be completely fabricated because his accuser wants his land. The accusation might be partially true, he stole horses, but also he's defending himself against someone who tried to kill him. None of that much matters in this moment, because the machinery of justice is not precise or carefully calibrated. It's rage with a quorum. This is the context in which frontier justice operated, and it's absolutely crucial to understanding 1800s American crime. The law, such as it existed in frontier regions, was absent or extraordinarily distant. A settler in Texas in 1835 might be hundreds of miles from the nearest functioning court. There was no police force. There was no way to formally press charges, no mechanism for investigation, no institutional apparatus for determining guilt or innocence. What existed was community consensus, armed men, and whatever rough version of justice could be assembled on the spot. And into this vacuum, predictably, rushed vigilantism. The most famous example of frontier justice competition is the regulator-moderator war, which sounds like something you'd see in a low-budget action film, but was actually a genuine armed conflict that took place in East Texas in the 1840s. The regulators started as a kind of vigilante organisation, aimed at addressing what they saw as inadequate law enforcement and rampant criminality in the region. They'd arrest suspects themselves, conduct their own trials, and dispense punishments up to and including execution. But here's where the story takes its genuinely disturbing turn. Competing vigilante factions emerged. The moderators formed essentially as a counter-organisation to the regulators, and soon the region had two heavily armed groups, both claiming to represent justice, both conducting extrajudicial trials and executions, both convinced that the other side was composed of criminals and tyrants. The situation deteriorated until actual pitched battles were fought between organised vigilante groups. Dozens of people died, and nobody was exactly sure anymore who were the criminals and who were the vigilantes supposed to be stopping them. One historical fact that emerges clearly from the regulator-moderator conflict is that frontier vigilantism, even when it started with seemingly legitimate goals, created conditions for absolute tyranny. Once a group of armed men decides it has the authority to arrest, try and execute people without legal oversight, the incentives are terrible. You can target enemies under the guise of justice. You can eliminate rivals by framing them as criminals. You can consolidate power by deciding that anyone who opposes you is guilty of something. The regulators, by most historical accounts, started as a response to genuine lawlessness and genuine criminal activity, but they evolved into an extrajudicial terror organisation. And when the moderators formed to oppose them, the entire region became essentially a war zone where two armed factions fought for control under the pretext of justice. Here's where the historical narrative gets genuinely complicated, though. Without formal law enforcement and courts, the regulators actually did address some real crimes and created some real order. There were criminals operating with near total impunity in East Texas, and they were preying on settlers and merchants. The regulators apprehended suspects, conducted trials of a sort, and did prevent some crimes through sheer force and presence. The logical nightmare of this is that an organisation composed of vigilante killers might be preferable to complete anarchy, but that's a deeply unsettling conclusion to reach. It suggests that frontier society faced a genuine choice between informal justice systems that might be tyrannical but were organised, or complete lawlessness with no remedy at all. Most of the time, communities chose the former, which says something dark about the desperation they felt. A quirky detail that often gets overlooked in accounts of frontier justice is that humour and mockery were actually tools of vigilante justice. Before an execution or severe punishment, the condemned person might be subjected to ritual humiliation, paraded through town, mocked publicly, made a spectacle of. This wasn't just cruelty, though it was certainly that. It was also a form of theatre designed to reinforce community values and validate the righteousness of the vigilantes' actions. Witnesses could spread the story, the condemned person could be made an example of, and the community could collectively affirm that whatever punishment was about to be administered was justified. It's a mechanism of crowd psychology, really. Turn the violence into a performance and the crowd becomes complicit in it. The fundamental tension that never got resolved on the frontier was this. How do you maintain order without courts, sheriffs, and legal institutions? The answer, demonstrated repeatedly across the 1800s American frontier, was poorly and often through worse violence than the crimes being addressed. Historians still argue about whether frontier vigilance committees were net positive or net negative, whether they prevented more crime than they committed, whether they accelerated or retarded the development of formal legal institutions, whether they represent early expressions of democratic self-governance or authoritarian mob rule. Probably the answer is that they were situationally variable. In some places, vigilante organisations transitioned relatively peacefully into formal law enforcement. In other places, like East Texas, they devolved into purely factional conflicts that had nothing to do with actual justice. What's undeniable is that the absence of formal law created conditions where armed men could essentially govern themselves and their communities with minimal accountability, and once that power exists, the people who hold it rarely relinquish it voluntarily. You're in San Francisco in 1849 and the city is exploding. A few years ago, this was a sleepy port town with a population of maybe 500 people. Now, there are 50,000, maybe more. Nobody's really counting because people are arriving daily on ships, overland routes, floating down from the mountains on rafts made of whatever materials they could assemble. The streets are mud. Buildings are hastily constructed wooden structures, many of them designed to burn down in spectacular fashion. The noise is overwhelming. Construction, shouting, horses, the constant sound of human chaos. And underneath all that noise is another sound, the sound of money. Gold. Gold in the ground. Gold on people, gold everywhere if you're willing to get dirty, risk your life, and potentially engage in criminal activity to acquire it. The California gold rush, which accelerated dramatically after the initial discoveries in 1848, created perhaps the single greatest crime explosion in 19th century American history. You had young men, mostly between 18 and 40, flooding into a region with virtually no law enforcement, minimal social structures, and massive amounts of portable wealth. The combination is almost mathematically guaranteed to produce high crime. What San Francisco and the mining camps experienced was essentially a controlled experiment in what happens when you remove all the normal social constraints on violence and theft. A lot of crime happened. A lot of murder happened. And the response from the organised citizens was to create vigilance committees that were in many ways just as lawless as the criminals they claimed to be opposing. The historical fact that's completely established is that San Francisco's crime rate in the 1850s was probably one of the highest in the world at that time period. The city was dangerous in ways that even other frontier towns weren't. There were organised gangs, spontaneous violence, robbery as a kind of standard commercial practice. Some estimates suggest that the crime rate in San Francisco during the height of the gold rush was equivalent to modern-day cities with far higher violence rates, adjusted for population. And here's the genuinely important historical detail. Most of this crime involved violence. It wasn't just property crime, it was assault, rape, and murder, on a scale that genuinely terrified the population. One major gang that operated during this period was the Sydney Ducks, so named because many of the members were convicts or former convicts from Sydney, Australia. Australia was literally dumping ground for British convicts, and some of them made their way to California, where they discovered that the absence of law enforcement was incredibly advantageous for crime. The Sydney Ducks were documented as running a protection racket, committing robberies, engaging in organised theft, and generally terrorising San Francisco. They'd identify targets, rob them, and if anyone resisted or attempted to report them to law enforcement, violence followed. The key innovation, if you can call organised crime an innovation, was that they operated as a coordinated gang with understood territories, methods, and a hierarchical structure. It wasn't just spontaneous violence, it was systematised predation. The Hounds were another major gang operating in San Francisco around 1849 to 1850, and they represent a particular kind of frontier violence. Organised thuggery that was often explicitly ethnic or racist in nature. The Hounds were primarily composed of white American and European immigrants, and they targeted immigrant communities, particularly Latin Americans and Chileans, who were competing for mining claims and business opportunities. The gang would attack settlements, burn buildings, rob people, and generally use organised violence to drive out competitors. What's genuinely disturbing about the Hounds is that some of them were former soldiers, and they operated with a quasi-military structure that made them more effective at violence than random mobs would have been. They committed what you might, in modern terms, call hate crimes, organised violence targeting people based on ethnic identity. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. During the gold rush, mining camps operated under their own justice systems, literally written constitutions and bylaws that determined how disputes would be resolved and crimes punished. One source claims that some mining camps had elaborate codes, with specific punishments for specific crimes, ranging from fines to whipping to execution. Historians still argue about how consistently these codes were actually enforced, versus how much they were just aspirational documents meant to impose order on chaos. But what's clear is that miners, organised into temporary camp governments, were trying to create legal structures that could function in the absence of formal government. Some camps had judges, some had juries, some had enforcer committees who carried out sentences. It was frontier justice, but sometimes it had an almost democratic quality to it, and sometimes it was just mob violence with a procedural veneer. The San Francisco Vigilance Committees of 1851 and 1856 represent, perhaps, the most dramatic example of organised vigilantism in the Gold Rush era. By the early 1850s, the official law enforcement and judicial system had largely collapsed under the weight of crime and the sheer population growth. The city had a sheriff and some deputies, but they were vastly outnumbered and often corrupt themselves. So a group of merchants and businessmen organised a vigilance committee, ostensibly designed to clean up the city and restore order. What they actually did was conduct mass trials, executions, and drive out anyone they considered undesirable, which included not just criminals but political rivals, members of competing ethnic groups, and generally anyone who threatened their economic interests. The 1856 committee actually took over the city government entirely for a brief period, ran for office, and conducted trials that resulted in multiple executions. The thing about gold rush crime and vigilantism is that it reveals the fundamental instability of frontier justice mechanisms. The vigilance committees claim to be temporary emergency measures necessitated by the collapse of formal law, but once they got a taste of extra legal power, they were loath to relinquish it. Once they executed people and got away with it, the bar for further violence lowered. Once they had consolidated enough power to rival the city government, the question stopped being whether their actions were justified and started being whether they would actually voluntarily dissolve. They didn't. Not really. The 1856 committee dissolved, but by then the precedent was set. In emergencies, armed citizens could bypass the courts and dispense justice unilaterally. Historians still argue whether the vigilance committees in San Francisco actually reduced crime, or whether they just changed the nature of the violence. The committees certainly stopped particular gang operations and executed or drove out specific criminals. But they also killed people who were innocent. They also engaged in organised violence that had nothing to do with crime prevention, and they created a lasting culture of extra-legal power that influenced San Francisco politics for decades afterward. What's unambiguous is that the gold rush created conditions: sudden wealth, massive population influx, absence of law enforcement, that produced both unprecedented crime and unprecedented vigilantism. And once both of those forces were unleashed, controlling them proved nearly impossible. You trudge through the smoke-filled memory of the Civil War, where the line between patriot and criminal was written in pencil and erased daily. We've already talked about the river pirates and the clever gold smugglers who found opportunity in chaos. But now we need to talk about a different kind of opportunity, one that didn't involve stealing from boats or mines. It involved killing. You see, the Civil War did something that nothing else in American history had quite managed before. It industrialized violence. It taught ordinary men, young men, boys sometimes, that taking a life wasn't some mystical act requiring moral wrestling. It was just what you did. You pointed, you fired, you moved on. The war created approximately 620,000 casualties between 1861 and 1865, and while most of those soldiers went home and tried to figure out what farming looked like again, a particular breed of fighter decided the violence was the only thing they'd ever been good at. Enter William Quantrill, a name most people have never heard but absolutely should have. Quantrill commanded an irregular unit of Confederate cavalry known as Quantrill's Raiders. Now, technically, they served the Confederate cause in Missouri and Kansas, but served might be too gentle a word. What they actually did was terrorize, raid, steal, and kill civilians and soldiers with an efficiency that horrified both sides of the conflict. The thing about irregular warfare is it has no referees. There are no rules, no Geneva Conventions slowly getting ratified in the future. There's just survival and the fever dream of victory. Quantrill's men were experts at hit-and-run raids. They'd emerge from the bushes, torches in hand, and set fire to homes and businesses. They'd steal horses and supplies, kill anyone who resisted, and vanish into the Missouri wilderness before Union forces could respond. The famous case everyone points to is the Lawrence Massacre of 1863, where Quantrill and his 300 riders attacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas, a town full of people sympathetic to the Union, and killed roughly 150 residents, burned buildings to ash, and left trauma scarred into the landscape. The dark genius of irregular warfare is that it trains men to enjoy that kind of work. You don't experience the impersonal death of a structured battle line, where cannonballs mow down dozens at once. Instead, you see your victim's face. You know what they own. You know their terror. And after a while, once you've done it enough, the moral machinery that prevents most humans from murdering stops grinding. It rusts. It stops. By the time the war ended, men like the ones who rode with Quantrill couldn't simply return to monotonous civilian life. They'd tasted power that came from a gun. They'd lived outside law and order now seemed like a cage. Some of Quantrill's raiders managed to turn into legitimate citizens after the war. Others didn't. Some, like William Quantrill himself, died during the conflict from war wounds. But the organisational structure he created, the idea of a mobile, violent gang using guerrilla tactics to rob and terrorize, that survived. It became a template. Young men who'd fought in irregular units during the war suddenly found themselves unemployed, traumatized, and skilled at exactly one thing. Banks existed everywhere now, full of money, guarded by single men if guarded at all. Trains carried payroll and valuables across states, and the federal government, which had just spent 4 years fighting a war, was exhausted, underfunded, and stretched thin across a continent trying to enforce Reconstruction. This is the crucial context historians still argue whether the banditry and outlaw gang activity of the 1870s and 1880s was genuinely political resistance to Reconstruction, or simple opportunism dressed up in lost cause mythology. Were men like Frank and Jesse James continuing the Confederate fight, or were they just using that story to justify being thieves and killers? The answer is probably both, and that ambiguity is what made the mythology stick. A bank robber might be a criminal, but a bank robber fighting to restore Southern honour. That's a hero. If you squint hard enough and ignore the murders and the stolen money that never actually went to any cause at all, you can see the through line now, can't you? The criminal underworld of early America, the river pirates, the gold rush claim jumpers, the vigilante committees that sometimes dissolved into simple mob rule. These were rough people in rough times. But the men created by the Civil War were different. They were organised. They were trained in violence by the government itself. They came home to a society that was fractured, resentful, and unstable. And they found that those skills, the ability to plan a coordinated attack, to move a group of armed men through territory quickly, to maintain loyalty through fear or shared cause, those skills translated perfectly into crime. The Civil War didn't just kill 620,000 people, it created a generation of killers and taught them that the line between patriotism and crime was negotiable. It was the birth of something new in American criminality, the organised outlaw gang, and within a few years, one particular family from Missouri would take that template and turn it into legend. You settle deeper into the pillows as we talk about the man who might be the most complicated figure in American criminal history, which is saying something, because we've already discussed a lot of complicated people. Jesse James is not a simple villain, and he's not really a simple hero either, but American popular culture has spent roughly 150 years trying to convince you that he's one or the other, depending on who's telling the story and what region they're from. The facts are these. Jesse Woodson James was born in 1847 in Missouri to a slave-holding family. His father died when Jesse was 3, his mother remarried, and Jesse grew up in a household marked by both privilege and increasing resentment of federal authority. He was too young to fight for most of the Civil War, but at around 16 he joined Quantrill's Raiders, the same violent, irregular unit we just talked about. He was good at it. Contemporary reports describe him as fearless, meticulous in planning, and ruthless in execution. By the end of the war, Jesse James was a veteran of years of guerrilla warfare. The war ended, and like so many others, he needed work. Now here's where it gets interesting. Jesse didn't immediately become an outlaw. According to most accounts, he actually tried to surrender peacefully to Union authorities in 1865. He was shot and wounded, whether accidentally or on purpose remains unclear. The wound was serious enough that he had to flee. Some historians suggest this incident radicalized him. Others suggest he'd always planned to turn to crime. The honest answer is probably that Jesse James, like many people, was shaped by specific moments and decisions, and we can't perfectly untangle his psychology from a distance of 150 years. What we do know is that in 1866, barely a year after the war ended, the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri was robbed of approximately $15,000. Nobody was formally arrested, but within a few years, the James brothers, Jesse and his older brother Frank, were suspected of this and several other robberies across Missouri. The thing about the James brothers is that they weren't sloppy criminals. They were terrifyingly competent. They planned their raids carefully. They worked with a rotating group of men who'd fought with them during the war, creating what historians sometimes call the James Younger Gang, since one of the most prominent members was Cole Younger, whom we'll spend much more time with in just a moment. What made Jesse James different from other bandits was that someone realised he could be turned into a myth. Enter the sympathetic newspaper. In the 1870s, a Missouri journalist named John Newman Edwards began publishing accounts of Jesse James's robberies that framed them as strikes against Reconstruction and Northern carpetbaggers. In Edwards's version, Jesse wasn't a criminal. He was a partisan freedom fighter, still waging the Confederate fight through banks instead of battlefields. He was Robin Hood in a Stetson. These newspapers found an audience, especially in the South and among former Confederates. Suddenly, Jesse James's image was being distributed across states, and he became a folk hero to people who'd lost the Civil War and were struggling under Reconstruction policies. The problem with this mythology is that it's essentially propaganda, and it obscures some uncomfortable truths. The banks Jesse James robbed weren't particularly targeting anyone. They were just banks. Some customers lost their life savings. Some of the robberies resulted in murders of people who had nothing to do with Reconstruction or politics, and the money from these robberies wasn't funding any cause. It was funding Jesse's lifestyle. Nice horses, nice clothes, constant travel. He wasn't a Celtic warrior fighting for the old country. He was a criminal who'd found that having a sympathetic press was incredibly useful for his brand, which is a depressing early example of how media and mythology can launder crime into heroism. Here's a light joke to soften the grim reality. Jesse James was basically the first influencer. He had a narrative, a carefully cultivated image, and people who circulated that image for him. Instead of Instagram, he had newspapers. Instead of follow accounts, he had wanted posters and legendary whispers in saloons. The metrics were different, but the basic strategy was the same. By the mid-1870s, Jesse James was arguably the most famous criminal in America. He'd robbed banks across Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and other states. He'd killed people. He'd also cultivated a reputation that made him to many people a legitimate folk hero. The federal government, particularly the Pinkerton Detective Agency, became obsessed with catching him. And Jesse, knowing he was hunted, did what many fugitives do. He tried to go legitimate. He moved to Tennessee under an assumed name and lived a quiet life for several years. He got married, he had kids, he tried to be normal. But normality didn't suit a man who'd lived his entire adult life in motion, in conflict, in the electric charge of violence and fame. By 1879, Jesse was getting drawn back into crime. He needed the action, he needed the legend. Or maybe historians still argue whether Jesse James was a true ideological fighter, who never fully accepted that the Confederacy had lost, or simply a man addicted to violence and attention, using politics as a justification. What we do know is that by 1880, Jesse had assembled a new gang, and they were planning robberies again. And this time, his luck was running out. A man named Robert Ford, part of the gang, was nursing a grudge. By 1882, that grudge would result in a bullet in Jesse's back, and one of America's most complicated criminals would be dead at 34. You feel your eyelids getting heavier as we move from Jesse James to the men who ran alongside him for most of his criminal career, the Younger brothers. Cole, Jim, John, and Bob Younger grew up in Missouri not far from the James family, lived through the same war, joined similar irregular units, and emerged from 1865 with the same skill set in violence and the same struggle to find legitimate work. But where the James brothers became legends, the Younger brothers became something else. They became cautionary tales. They became proof that crime doesn't pay, at least not forever, and that even sympathy and mythology can't protect you if you make one catastrophic mistake. The Younger brothers started their criminal career around the same time as the James brothers. They were present at some of the same robberies. Cole Younger was considered nearly equal to Jesse James in terms of planning and capability. But the Younger brothers made one crucial decision that the James brothers avoided until very late in their careers. They moved east. In 1876, with federal pressure mounting and opportunities dwindling in Missouri and Kansas, Cole, Jim, John, and Bob Younger decided to venture into Minnesota. Minnesota was choking with banks in 1876, but it didn't have the same sympathy for the lost cause that Missouri did. Minnesotans, by and large, had fought for the Union. They'd bled for it. The idea that former Confederates were now romantic figures was not taking root in places like Northfield. This is a detail that matters, because it means the Younger brothers were moving into territory where they had no cultural advantage. Jesse James had newspapers in Missouri publishing his legend. The Younger brothers had only guns and horses and a reputation for violence that didn't translate into sympathy. The target was the First National Bank in Northfield. The plan was simple, like most successful robberies. Go in fast, take the money, get out. There were 8 men in the gang for this job. The 4 Younger brothers plus 4 other criminals. On September 7th, 1876, they rode into Northfield in broad daylight, split into two groups and attempted their robbery. What happened next reveals something important about the difference between mythology and reality, between legend and lived experience. The citizens of Northfield didn't just roll over, they fought back. A hardware store owner named J.S. Allen was shot and killed, but his death enraged the townspeople rather than terrifying them. People grabbed guns, shopkeepers armed themselves, bank tellers refused to open the vault. The robbery that was supposed to be simple became catastrophic. The gang fought their way back to their horses and fled the town, but they were slow leaving, they were wounded, and Northfield residents pursued them on horseback. What happened over the next few days is sometimes called the Death Ride, or the Great Escape, depending on who's telling the story and whether they're trying to make it sound romantic or desperate. The Younger brothers and their gang fled through Minnesota and into South Dakota and Iowa. They were pursued by local law enforcement, by vigilantes, and by ordinary citizens deputized on the spot. They were starving. They were injured. Cole Younger had been shot multiple times, Jim Younger was injured, Bob Younger was severely wounded. They were sleeping in the woods, moving constantly, with pursuers always seemingly a few hours behind them. It was nothing like the clean, glorious mythology of earlier robberies, it was just suffering. Eventually 3 of the gang members, including Charlie Pitts, the only non-Younger gang member we should mention, were killed in a final shootout. The 4 Younger brothers were captured, and here's where things get interesting from a criminal justice perspective. The Younger brothers stood trial in Minnesota. They were convicted, and they received life sentences. Multiple historians still argue whether the Younger brothers received disproportionately harsh sentences because of their Confederate associations and Reconstruction-era resentment, or whether they simply drew the unlucky circumstance of being tried in a state that had no sympathy for Southern outlaws. The evidence suggests a mixture of both. Life in a Minnesota prison was a profound change from life on the road with a gun. Cole Younger spent decades in prison and gradually became something unexpected, a model inmate. He participated in prison programs, he worked toward rehabilitation. By the 1890s, he was being released on parole, then eventually fully pardoned. He lived another 40 years and spent much of that time giving lectures about his criminal past and the consequences of crime. He became, ironically, a cautionary tale. He travelled around speaking to schoolchildren about how the outlaw life had ruined him, destroyed his health, cost him his freedom. Jim Younger served decades in prison and was eventually released, only to die by suicide, whether from lingering trauma from the Northfield disaster or from struggles with depression and addiction remains unclear. Bob Younger also died in prison. John Younger had actually been killed years earlier, in 1874, by a man hunting the bounty on his head. Of the 4 Younger brothers who rode into Northfield with such confidence, only Cole lived a substantial life afterward, and that life was spent publicly repenting his past. This is what separates the Younger brothers from the James brothers in popular memory. James got shot in the back by someone in his own gang, which made him a martyr. The Younger brothers got caught, tried, and imprisoned. They had to actually live with the consequences of their choices, not as dramatic mythology but as decades of lost freedom. And that reality, that unglamorous suffering, is probably more truthful than any legend. The Younger brothers proved that crime doesn't require a dramatic ending. Sometimes it just requires you to make one mistake, riding into Northfield instead of staying in Missouri, and then spending the rest of your life paying for it. You're getting drowsy now, and we're shifting to different territory. Still outlaws and violence, but a different kind, in a different landscape. We've been mostly dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War, with men shaped by that conflict. But Billy the Kid never fought in the Civil War. He was born after it ended, in 1859 or 1860, depending on who you ask. Yet he became perhaps the most mythologized outlaw in American history, a figure so wrapped in legend that the actual person underneath has become almost impossible to locate. Billy's early life was unremarkable. His mother died when he was a child. His father was largely absent. He grew up poor in Indiana and later Kansas, a vagrant, possibly homeless for periods. There's some suggestion he was involved in petty theft as a child, the kind of survival crime that poor kids sometimes commit when nobody's feeding them. By his early teens, he drifted west to New Mexico Territory, where he worked as a ranch hand, a labourer, and apparently fell in with a gang of cattle rustlers. This is where his story begins to intersect with organised crime. The thing about New Mexico Territory in the 1870s is that it was a place where ordinary property disputes turned into gunfights, because there was no effective law enforcement to resolve them through courts. The wealthy cattle barons, the landowners with power and resources, essentially ruled their territories. If you stole their cattle, or if they stole yours, resolution came through violence. If you wanted something someone else had, you took it with a gun, or you didn't take it at all. Billy the Kid got tangled up in one of these property disputes, specifically the Lincoln County War, which sounds like a formal military conflict, but was really just a series of escalating gunfights between rival merchant and cattle ranching families. On one side was a merchant faction led by Alexander McSween and John Tunstall. On the other side was basically established authority, a merchant named Lawrence Murphy and his partner James Dolan. The conflict ostensibly was about business practices and control of supply contracts, but it quickly became personal and violent. Billy, it seems, had worked for Tunstall and was present when Tunstall was killed. Whether Billy actually fired the shot that killed Tunstall is disputed, but Tunstall's death definitely radicalized him. He became part of a group of gunfighters, often called the Regulators, who were supposedly trying to enforce justice against Murphy's faction. What they were really doing was participating in an escalating gang war. Here's a slightly unsettling fact that historians often gloss over. Billy the Kid was probably a better gunfighter than most of the mythology gives him credit for, but he wasn't the invincible legend that popular culture created. Contemporary accounts describe him as quick, accurate, and quick-tempered. He was good in a gunfight, but he was also young, impulsive, and caught up in a situation that was increasingly beyond anyone's control. The Lincoln County War eventually involved the territorial governor, federal troops, and a genuine siege of the town of Lincoln where Billy was trapped. He escaped from that siege and became a fugitive. For several years, Billy drifted through New Mexico and into Texas and Arizona, sometimes rustling cattle, sometimes working legitimate jobs, sometimes just existing in the cracks of the law. The territorial authorities set a price on his head, and eventually a man named Pat Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County with a specific mandate to catch Billy the Kid. Garrett was a competent lawman, but more importantly, he was ambitious. Catching Billy the Kid would make his career, and he pursued that goal with focus and efficiency. In 1880, after Billy had been on the run for several years, Garrett finally tracked him down to a building where Billy was supposedly hiding. Garrett shot and killed Billy, though some accounts suggest Billy was unarmed, and other accounts suggest there was a struggle. The death was murky, and immediately became contested. Was Garrett shooting a dangerous criminal, or executing a fugitive who might have been trying to surrender? Historians still argue whether Pat Garrett murdered Billy the Kid in cold blood or simply did his job as a lawman, and the debate obscures the most important truth. Billy was dead at 21 or 22, killed by a man doing his job. What happened next is the inflation of myth. Billy the Kid had already been legend while alive, his exploits exaggerated in newspapers, his gunfights made more dramatic than they were. After his death, particularly in the 20th century, he became a folk hero to rival Jesse James. Books were written about him, movies were made. He became the symbol of the Wild West, the brave outlaw against oppressive authority, the symbol of youth-defying civilization. None of this is accurate. Billy wasn't fighting authority on principle. He was a poor kid caught up in a property dispute between wealthy men who happened to use violence as their primary tool of negotiation. He got good with a gun because he had to. He died because he was a fugitive and the sheriff did his job. The mundane reality of Billy's life is so much less interesting than the myth that Americans collectively decided to ignore the reality. We wanted a Robin Hood figure, so we created one. We wanted a tragic hero defying a corrupt system, so we rewrote the Lincoln County War as that story instead of what it actually was. A series of gunfights between various factions fighting over cattle and contracts. The truth is that Billy the Kid was a mediocre criminal who happened to die young, and because he died young, Americans made him immortal through legend. The greatest irony is that this young man, who actually existed and had an actual life, has become completely lost underneath the fictional character named Billy the Kid. You're fading now, your mind growing heavier, and we're coming to the final great outlaw saga, or at least final for tonight. Wyatt Earp and the gunfight near the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, is perhaps the most famous gunfight in American history, and like everything else we've discussed, it's been mythologized to the point where the actual event has become almost invisible underneath the legend. Tombstone. Arizona, in 1881, was a boom town. Silver had been discovered in the surrounding hills and people flooded in. There was money everywhere. There were merchants and miners and railroad workers, and inevitably there were criminals. There were gamblers and confidence men and rustlers and killers. There was very little law enforcement. A town growing that fast with that much money and that many desperate people is a powder keg. Gunfights happened over poker games, over mining claims, over women, over perceived slights. The town was chaotic and violent and exciting, at least if you were the kind of person who enjoyed chaos and violence. Wyatt Earp came to Tombstone in 1881. He wasn't there as a lawman initially. He was there because his brother James had invested in silver mining, and Wyatt wanted to try his hand at prospecting and business. Wyatt had some history in law enforcement in other territories. He'd been a deputy in Dodge City, Kansas, and had a reputation as someone who could handle violent situations. But in Tombstone, he was theoretically a civilian. He had his brother Virgil, who was a deputy US Marshal, and his brother Morgan, who eventually also became a lawman. But Wyatt himself wasn't officially employed as law enforcement for most of the period we're discussing. What Wyatt wanted was stability and profit. What Tombstone was offering was chaos. The chaos came in the form of a group of local ranchers and rustlers, known colloquially as the Cowboys. This isn't a name they chose for themselves, it's what locals called them, and it carries a connotation of being uncivilized, lawless. The Cowboys' most prominent members were Curly Bill Clanton, his father Old Man Clanton, and a few other men with overlapping interests in rustling cattle and generally ignoring law enforcement. The Cowboys saw Tombstone as their territory. The Earp brothers, particularly Wyatt, who had capital and ambition, saw Tombstone as a place to make money and build a future. These two visions of Tombstone were fundamentally incompatible. The Cowboys weren't going to respect Wyatt's property or authority, and Wyatt wasn't going to tolerate their lawlessness. There were confrontations, there were killings. A man named Morgan Earp was shot dead through a window while playing pool, murdered, probably by cowboys, definitely by someone. Another man named Fred White, a town marshal, was shot and killed. The violence was escalating, and the cause wasn't actually ideological or political. It was territorial. It was about who got to control Tombstone and its resources. The gunfight that's famous didn't start the conflict, and it didn't end it either. It was a moment, a 30-second explosion of gunfire that happened on October 26, 1881, near or at the OK Corral, depending on the exact accounting of geography. Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and a man named Doc Holliday. A gunfighter and possibly a confidence man with tuberculosis, which is a detail that deserves its own sentence because tuberculosis in the Old West is genuinely tragic. Encountered several of the cowboys. There was a confrontation. Someone drew a gun. Gunfire erupted. When the 30 seconds were over, 3 men were dead. Billy Clanton and 2 other cowboys. Wyatt was grazed by a bullet. Morgan was grazed. Virgil was shot. Doc Holliday was grazed. It was violent, it was quick, and it was absolutely unglorious from a historical accuracy perspective. But it was famous. Newspapers across the country published accounts of the gunfight. Here's a joke for you. The gunfight near the OK Corral was hyped the exact way modern media hypes celebrity scandals. Suddenly the Earp brothers were nationally known. They were heroes, or they were villains, depending on which newspapers you read. In the East they were brave lawmen restoring order. In the West, particularly in places sympathetic to the cowboys, they were aggressive outsiders murdering local men. The narrative wasn't actually determined by what happened in those 30 seconds. It was determined by editorial choice. What happened after was actually more violent and more consequential than the famous gunfight. Over the next several years, the Cowboys waged a vendetta ride against the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday. Morgan Earp was murdered, clearly intentional, shot from cover. Virgil Earp was shot and wounded. Wyatt and Doc Holliday responded by pursuing and killing several cowboys in what became known as the vendetta ride. It was escalating brutal violence, and it didn't have a clean resolution. The cowboys didn't surrender. The Earp brothers didn't defeat them. Eventually the violence just kind of wound down. People left Tombstone. The moment of fever broke. Historians still argue whether the OK Corral gunfight was a legitimate law enforcement action against rustlers and murderers, or whether it was an aggressive act by outsiders trying to impose their vision of order on a town that had developed its own rough equilibrium. The answer, again, is probably that it was both. The cowboys were almost certainly rustling cattle, and almost certainly murdered people. The Earp brothers were almost certainly imposing themselves as authority without having been truly elected to do so. Both things were true. Both sides had valid grievances and both sides were willing to kill over them. What's interesting about the Earp brothers, compared to Jesse James or Billy the Kid, is that Wyatt Earp actually survived to old age. He lived until 1929, which means he spent decades after the Tombstone gunfights watching his legend grow and grow. He gave interviews. He participated in early Western films. He watched as people created Wyatt Earp the myth and the actual person, a man who'd been primarily motivated by profit and stability, who'd gotten tangled up in violence mostly because he happened to be where the conflict was, became invisible underneath the hero. By the time Wyatt died, the OK Corral gunfight had been made into legend so thoroughly that hardly anyone remembered the actual circumstances. It was a showdown between heroes and villains. It was civilization versus lawlessness. It was brave lawmen against savage outlaws. None of that is quite true. It was 30 seconds of violence that resulted from months of territorial conflict, and it mattered mostly because people decided it mattered, decided it meant something bigger than it actually did. This is the pattern we've seen throughout. Crime, legend, mythology, and eventually the actual events completely lost underneath the stories we tell about them. And now, as you drift off to sleep, you're carrying with you the stories Americans told themselves about themselves, which were always more interesting than the truth. You're settling deeper into your pillow now, and we're about to meet some of the most romanticized outlaws in American history. Though the real story is way weirder and funnier than the legends suggest. Picture yourself in the 1880s and 1890s, out west, where the railways are crisscrossing the landscape like veins pumping money across the country. This is the world of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Two outlaws who are basically the cool kids of crime, the ones who robbed trains and banks with a kind of casual style that got poets writing about them decades later. Here's the thing about Butch Cassidy. His real name was Robert Leroy Parker, and before he became a household name in outlaw circles, he was just another broke rancher's kid who couldn't quite make ends meet. Around 1884, he made the fateful decision to stop playing it straight and started robbing banks instead. Charming move, but remarkably successful. Butch had this quality that you don't see in a lot of desperados. He was funny, like genuinely hilarious. He'd crack jokes while robbing trains, which sounds insane until you realise that humour is actually a pretty solid survival strategy when you're hanging out with a bunch of armed men who could turn on you at any moment. Laughter burns off tension faster than anything else. The Sundance Kid, Harry Longabaugh to be formal about it, first met Butch in Wyoming, and they became something like best friends, which is touching and deeply strange when you think about the whole armed robbery thing. Together with a loose network of other outlaws, they formed what became known as the Wild Bunch. And here's where it gets genuinely historically interesting. The Wild Bunch wasn't some rigid gang with bylaws and membership cards. It was more like a rotating crew of guys who showed up for jobs and then scattered back to their hideouts. The main hub was a place called Hole in the Wall, a hidden valley in Wyoming nestled between rock walls so narrow that if you didn't know where you were going, you'd miss it entirely. Modern historians still argue whether Hole in the Wall was actually as fortress-like as the legend suggests, or if it was just a moderately inconvenient place to find people. What made Butch and Sundance special, and this is the historical meat here, was their technical innovation. They didn't just rob trains the old-fashioned way, waving guns and shouting. They studied the railroad schedules. They learned which cars carried the most money. They figured out that express cars had safes, and safes could be blown open with dynamite if you timed it right. In 1900, they hit the Overland Flyer and made off with what amounts to maybe $40,000 in modern money. It was surgical. It was almost corporate in its efficiency. You could practically imagine them as railroad executives except for the whole running away to hide in the mountains part. The camaraderie here is what gets lost in most retellings. These weren't angry men driven by rage or revenge. They were competent professionals who enjoyed each other's company. They played cards together at Hole in the Wall. They presumably told stories. One of them, a guy named Harry Tracy, apparently went out one day, shot up a town just for fun, came back, and told everyone about it like he'd been fishing. They laughed. That's either the saddest or funniest thing you'll ever hear about 1890s frontier life, and historians can't decide which. The chase eventually became unbearable. Railroad detective agencies got better. The Pinkertons, who you remember from earlier, the ones who were probably watching Jesse James, got very invested in catching Butch. So in 1901, with the frontier closing up and nowhere left to run, Butch made a stunning decision. He and Sundance's girlfriend Etta Place sailed to South America. Argentina, specifically. Bolivia after that. They tried running cattle. They tried mining. They even opened a ranch and, for a few years, actually lived quietly without robbing anything, which seems like a plot twist that nobody expected from the Wild Bunch brand. Then the chase started again. And here's where the story gets delightfully murky. In 1908, in a small Bolivian town called San Vicente, Butch and Sundance found themselves cornered by local soldiers. What happened next is the subject of endless debate. The official story is that they died in a shootout. Some people say Butch escaped and lived a quiet life under an assumed name. Some people say he came back to the United States and nobody ever knew. Historians still argue whether the men who died in San Vicente were actually Cassidy and Sundance, or just two random outlaws. What we know for sure is that they stopped robbing trains, stopped sending letters, and vanished into either legend or death, which, given their lives, is probably the most fitting ending possible. You can almost see it. Two guys on the other side of the world learning that you can't outrun the people chasing you, no matter how charming you are or how well you plan your robberies. The frontier runs out, the space disappears, and maybe that's the real lesson here. The thing that separates Butch and Sundance from the earlier desperados you've been learning about. They were smart enough to know when the game was ending. They just chose to keep playing anyway. As you drift further into these stories, we're about to meet someone completely different. An outlaw who was basically a Victorian gentleman who happened to commit felonies with remarkable poetry. Black Bart, whose real name was Charles Earl Bowles, but sometimes went by C. Bowles, is one of the strangest figures in American criminal history, because he seems less like a bandit and more like a literature professor who took a very wrong turn. Here's what makes Black Bart unique. He robbed stagecoaches across California for nearly a decade, and yet nobody could quite figure out what he wanted or who he really was. He was impossibly polite. When he robbed stagecoaches travelling through the Sierra Nevada mountains in the 1870s and 1880s, he would often apologise. He'd say things like, "I'm truly sorry to trouble you," while relieving passengers of their valuables. He never fired a shot. He never physically harmed anyone. It was like being mugged by a really apologetic ghost. But here's the genuinely historical part. Black Bart became famous not because of his robberies, but because he left poems. At the scenes of his crimes, he'd scribble little verses on the inside of express boxes or leave them behind like calling cards. And these weren't just crude doggerel. They were actual composed pieces with metre and rhyme and genuine literary structure. One read, "I've laboured long and hard for bread, for honour and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches." Quirky detail that almost nobody knows. He sometimes signed them with the name Black Bart, which is kind of like signing your crimes. He was basically the only robber in American history who wanted everyone to know it was him personally committing the thefts. Charles Bowles came out of nowhere, which is typical of many 1800s criminals. There's a long stretch where nobody knows anything about him, and then suddenly he appears in the historical record with a gun and a grudge. He was somewhere in his 50s when he started robbing stagecoaches, which makes him either incredibly desperate or incredibly confident that he could get away with it. Probably both. He targeted Wells Fargo stages specifically, which makes sense because Wells Fargo was the company actually carrying the valuable shipments. Between 1875 and 1883, he robbed something like 28 stages. He killed nobody. He was methodical. He had a system. He was in every measurable way the most successful stagecoach robber in California history. The contrast between Black Bart the gentleman and Charles Bowles, the criminal, is genuinely disturbing once you think about it. By day, or during the times he wasn't robbing stagecoaches, he lived in San Francisco as a seemingly respectable man. He rented rooms, he had lodgings, he was known to be cultured and well-spoken. People described him as neat, tidy, polite, and refined. He read. He probably composed his poetry while sitting at a desk in some small room, crafting verse about his victims while planning his next robbery. It's like he had two completely separate personalities that never met, which is absolutely not how human psychology works, but somehow seemed to work for him. The California authorities were baffled. They knew someone was robbing these stages, and they knew whoever it was had genuine talent for the work. Planning routes, timing schedules, knowing exactly where guards would be stationed. But they couldn't catch him. and the poetry made it worse because now they had a celebrity criminal, someone people were rooting for in a weird way. He became the protagonist of a story he was writing himself, which is either the smartest or dumbest thing an outlaw can do. His downfall came through DNA before DNA existed. After one robbery in 1883, authorities found a handkerchief at the scene. Bowles had left behind laundry marks. Laundry marks. The universe's way of reminding us that you can be a literary genius and still make incredibly stupid mistakes. The marks led them to a laundry in San Francisco, which led them to Charles Bowles, which led to his arrest and conviction. He served time in San Quentin. When he got out, he essentially vanished. Nobody knows exactly what happened to him after his release, though some sources suggest he went to Baja California and died there. What's historically fascinating about Black Bart, and this is the historians still argue whether section, is that historians still argue whether he was actually mentally ill or just operating on some kind of code that made sense only to him. Was he a gentleman forced into crime? Was he a criminal with a guilty conscience? Was he performing poetry robbery as some kind of artistic statement about capitalist commerce? The truth is probably that he was just a complex human being who had apparently decided that committing felonies, while leaving behind carefully crafted verse, was a reasonable way to spend his 50s and early 60s, which is arguably the weirdest life choice in this entire story. You lie here, almost asleep, thinking about a man writing poetry in a San Francisco room, knowing that tomorrow or next week he'll walk into the mountains and politely relieve Wells Fargo of its money, and that his laundry marks will eventually betray him. There's something almost tragically romantic about it if you ignore the whole "he was literally committing armed robbery" part. Keep your eyes closed as we move deeper into the criminal evolution of America, because now we're talking about a crime that didn't really exist until it was invented: the train robbery. And the people who invented it, ironically, did so in your home state. Well, probably. The Reno brothers, out of Indiana, were the first people in American history to rob a moving train, which is such a specific achievement that you have to respect it in a weird way. They basically invented a crime category. The year was 1866, just a year after the Civil War ended, which is worth noting because train robbery became more common as soon as former soldiers realised that trains carried massive amounts of money and were, compared to most security situations, surprisingly vulnerable. The Reno brothers, John, Simeon, Frank and William, got on a train heading west, walked through the cars with guns and walked off with a bunch of cash. It sounds absurdly simple because it was. Almost everything about human criminality is absurdly simple until someone invents a better defence against it. What made train robbery different from stagecoach robbery or bank robbery was the mathematical problem of escape. You had to get on a moving vehicle, commit your crime, and get off a moving vehicle, all while the vehicle was going fast enough that jumping off could kill you. The Reno brothers solved this by stopping the train first. They'd arrange for an accomplice to pull the emergency brake or by just threatening the engineer until he stopped the train. Suddenly the equation changed. You had a giant vehicle full of money that wasn't moving anymore, guards who were probably confused, and a relatively straightforward robbery situation. The innovation was brilliant and, as you've probably guessed, absolutely catastrophic for train safety. Once the Reno brothers proved that train robbery was possible, every criminal with vaguely competent planning skills decided to give it a shot. Train robbery became so common by the 1880s that railroads had to completely restructure their security. The express cars, the specialised cars carrying high-value goods and money, got better safes, better guards, and eventually guns. The arms race between robbers and railroads was like watching two sides of an engineering competition where the stakes were incredibly high and the cost of losing meant either prison or death. Here's the historically important part. Railroad companies didn't call the police for train robberies. They hired their own detectives. The most famous was Alan Pinkerton and his detective agency, which you remember from the Jesse James era. The Pinkertons operated like a private army. They had authority that regular lawmen didn't have. They could track suspects across state lines. They could set up sting operations. They could, and this is where it got dark, conduct counterintelligence operations against the outlaws. When the Reno brothers got too comfortable with their success, the Pinkertons caught them, and they hanged, though the official story says it was a mob lynching because Indiana had a strange relationship with the law back then. Historians still argue whether the Pinkertons actually orchestrated the lynching, or just looked the other way. which is the kind of moral ambiguity that makes 1860s railroad justice absolutely unpleasant to think about. The train robbery game evolved fast because it had to. Express car safes got heavier, robbers got more dynamite, guards got better training, trains started carrying decoy shipments to confuse robbers. Robbers started getting intelligence from inside men working for the railroads. It was a genuine technological and tactical arms race, and you can almost imagine it like a chess match, where both sides kept adding more powerful pieces to the board until the game became unrecognisable. By the 1880s and 1890s, train robbery had become professionalised in a way that earlier crimes had never been. You had specialists. You had guys who were good at explosives, guys who were good at horsemanship, guys who were good at planning routes. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, remember them from our last section, settling sleepily into your memory, were really the apex of this professionalisation. They approached train robbery like a technical problem to be solved, and they solved it better than anyone else because they actually studied the trains. One genuinely quirky detail that almost nobody mentions: some robbers were so successful at understanding train schedules that they could predict, almost to the minute, exactly when the guards would change shifts and where the train would be most vulnerable. It was applied mathematics. It was logistics planning. It was crime as engineering. The railroad companies eventually realized they couldn't win through innovation alone. They needed legislation. So they pushed for laws that made train robbery a capital offence in most states, which is why so many train robbers ended up hanged rather than imprisoned. The punishment escalation made the crime less common not because people got better at preventing it, but because dying became more statistically likely. You're drifting now, thinking about express cars and safes and dynamite and men calculating train schedules in lamplight, trying to find the moment when a moving vehicle would be vulnerable enough to rob. It's almost mathematical poetry if poetry could be about armed felonies. Sinking deeper now into a different kind of crime story. Not the dramatic robbery narrative, but the uglier story of land, cattle and violence on the American frontier. Forget the romantic tales of gentleman bandits and clever train robbers. This section is about range wars, and range wars are significantly less fun and significantly more brutal. Picture Wyoming in the 1880s and 1890s, where the fundamental question wasn't how do we rob things, but rather who owns the land and how far will they go to keep everyone else off it. The Johnson County War was basically the moment when the frontier's fundamental conflict became violent enough that the entire nation noticed. Big cattlemen, men who owned massive ranches with thousands of head of cattle, were terrified of two things: small homesteaders who were moving in and claiming land under the Homestead Act, and cattle rustlers who were stealing their herds. The weird part is that these concerns were maybe half legitimate. Homesteaders were indeed claiming land, which was their legal right. Rustlers were indeed stealing cattle, which was their crime. But the big ranchers' solution was to hire gunmen, men explicitly hired to threaten, intimidate, and if necessary kill smaller ranchers and suspected rustlers. These hired guns called themselves regulators, which is like naming your private army the definitely not a private army committee. The actual Johnson County War in 1892 was a genuinely shocking moment in American history, because it was basically the moment when a private military force tried to overthrow local government. The big ranchers, members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, hired about 50 gunmen and set out to regulate the county by force. They made a list of suspected rustlers, they planned arrests, they had a whole operation, and they started executing people, shooting people in their homes at night, killing suspected rustlers without any kind of legal process whatsoever. It was closer to an invasion than to any kind of law enforcement, and it would have been absolutely catastrophic except that the governor of Wyoming eventually called in the National Guard and stopped it. Here's the historical fact that matters. Nobody died in the actual Johnson County conflict, which is shocking given how badly it could have gone. People died in skirmishes leading up to it, and people died in individual confrontations throughout the 1880s, but the war itself was stopped before it became a full-scale massacre. The hired gunmen got arrested, some were convicted, some escaped. The fundamental conflict between big ranchers and small ranchers persisted, but the moment of extreme violence passed. The lesson that society learned was that private armies can't solve territorial disputes, which was apparently a hard lesson because people keep trying it anyway. The second part of this conflict was the fence-cutting wars, when big ranchers started fencing their land with barbed wire, a relatively new technology at the time, Small ranchers and drovers who'd been using open range to move cattle suddenly found themselves blocked, so they cut the fences. They'd ride out at night with wire cutters and just remove the barriers, which is such a passive-aggressive form of protest that you have to respect it. The ranchers would put the fences back up. The small ranchers would cut them again. It went on for years. Historians still argue whether the fence-cutting wars were primarily about legitimate grievances over open range access, or whether they were just cover for cattle rustlers to move stolen herds, which is probably one of those situations where both things were true, depending on who you talk to. The cattle itself, you have to understand, was the foundation of the entire conflict. Cattle meant wealth. Cattle meant power. Cattle also meant that if you were a small rancher or a drover, you could actually make money on the frontier rather than just barely surviving. The big ranchers wanted to maintain absolute control over the cattle economy, which meant preventing smaller operators from getting established. It wasn't really about rustling, though rustling existed and was a genuine problem. It was about market dominance. It was about monopoly. It was capitalism shooting people in the night because they were undercutting prices and preventing the big operators from being absolutely dominant. One genuinely quirky detail: the Wyoming Stock Growers Association kept meticulous records. They literally had a list. They didn't hide that they had a list of people they wanted removed. They published it. It's like they were so confident in their power that they didn't think legal consequences would matter, which, for a long time, they didn't. The hired gunmen operated with a kind of immunity because the local government couldn't or wouldn't stop them. It took the governor and the National Guard to create a situation where law might matter. You're almost asleep now, thinking about men cutting barbed wire in darkness, about ranchers writing names on lists, about the strange way that violence becomes possible when you convince yourself that you're defending what's rightfully yours. The frontier's closing and people are fighting over the scraps, and some of those fights involve guns and hired assassins and governors and National Guards. It's the moment when the myth of the wild frontier collides with the reality of industrial capitalism and organised violence. You're nearly gone now, drowsy and drifting as we approach the final piece of the 1800s criminal puzzle, the gunfighter mythology, and how it compares to the actual history of frontier violence. This is the tricky part because the real story involves shattering some truly beautiful lies that you've probably believed your entire life. Here's the fundamental historical fact. The quick-draw duel, two gunfighters facing off in the middle of the street, waiting for someone to blink first, then drawing and firing in one fluid motion, is almost entirely mythological. It almost never happened. The legendary gunfights that define the Wild West in popular imagination were either exaggerated, happened differently than described, or were straight up invented by dime novel writers and later film producers. This is genuinely disappointing if you are hoping for frontier romance, but it's also kind of interesting once you start thinking about why people invented this mythology. The actual gunfights that did happen were typically messy, stupid, and anticlimactic. In most cases, people shot each other from relatively close range in saloons or on streets, while other people were screaming. There weren't dramatic pauses. There wasn't noble acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. There was usually alcohol, confusion, and people trying to shoot before they got shot. Wild Bill Hickok, and you've probably heard of him, did engage in several gunfights, and from what we can reconstruct, they were nothing like the duels described in later accounts. One supposedly legendary gunfight between Hickok and Davis Tutt happened in Springfield, Missouri in 1865, and yes, they did face off, and yes, one of them shot the other. Hickok won. It lasted maybe a minute. That's it. No mystical standoff, no heroic moment. 1 minute of frontier chaos that got mythologized into an eternal legend. John Wesley Hardin was apparently an actual gunfighter who actually killed a lot of people. Accounts range from about 20 to 40 murders depending on who you ask. But his life story is so unreliable that historians still argue whether he was actually a gunslinger or a murderer who killed people in ambushes and back alleys and then got mistaken for a duelist. Hardin himself claimed dozens of kills. Historical records suggest something significantly less impressive but still terrifying. What we do know is that he eventually got convicted of murder, served prison time, and then got shot and killed by a man who basically ambushed him in El Paso. So his legend involves a lot of shooting, but the actual documented history suggests he was more of a serial killer than a noble gunslinger. Clay Allison was another figure that got mythologized heavily. He claimed to have killed men. Some accounts suggest he did. Some accounts suggest most of his reputation came from bar fights and brawling rather than actual gunplay. The problem with 1800s frontier history is that we often don't have reliable documentation. We have newspaper accounts written by people with agendas. We have memoirs written decades later by people with failing memories. We have legends that got repeated so often they became historical facts. Historians still argue whether Clay Allison was actually a gunfighter, or just a very violent drunk who got into a lot of fights and happened to live long enough to build a reputation. Here's the genuinely historical fact. Cowtowns, Dodge City, Tombstone, Abilene, and a few others, actually experienced very little gun violence compared to their reputation. They were rowdy, sure, cowboys got drunk, saloon fights happened, but actual gunfights were rare. So rare that newspapers would cover them extensively because they were newsworthy. And once newspapers covered them extensively, dime novelists would embellish them, and suddenly a minor shooting became a legendary duel. The feedback loop created a mythology that had almost no connection to what actually happened. One genuinely quirky detail: several cowtowns passed ordinances banning the carrying of firearms. Dodge City, for instance, had laws requiring people to check their guns at the sheriff's office or the livery. Tombstone had similar rules. These laws were remarkably effective at reducing violence. The irony is that the towns that are most famous for wild gunslinging violence actually had pretty strict gun control. The mythology involves lawlessness and freedom, but the reality involves municipal ordinances and law enforcement taking reasonable precautions against violence. Which honestly is way less exciting, but way more sensible. You're almost asleep now, thinking about how we've convinced ourselves that the frontier was defined by dramatic one-on-one duels, when the actual history is way weirder. It's about ambushes and bar fights and misrepresented newspapers and dime novels. It's about the strange machinery of creating legend from reality, of taking somebody who was maybe just a violent drunk and turning him into a mythical gunslinger. It's about how much more appealing the lie is than the truth, and how the lie becomes so powerful that it drowns out the actual history. The frontier wasn't ending with dramatic duels and noble violence. It was ending with sheriffs enforcing no-guns ordinances and judges handling trial cases and railroad detectives catching train robbers, and big ranchers hiring assassins, and the whole wild thing just slowly becoming domesticated by law and regulation and administrative procedure. Not as exciting as the mythology, but genuinely more interesting if you think about it carefully. You're lying in bed now, your eyelids already feeling a bit heavy, and we're about to talk about a family who made what might be the worst business decision in American criminal history. The Dalton Gang. Yes, that's right. Another family of outlaws, because apparently in the 1800s, crime really was a family affair. You're getting tired just thinking about how much effort that would require, and honestly, that's the healthy response. Frank and Grat Dalton were the main architects of this particular disaster, though they had their brothers Bob and Emmett riding alongside them. These guys started out as lawmen, if you can believe it. Frank and Grat actually worked as deputy marshals for Judge Isaac Parker in Indian Territory, which means they had badges, regular paychecks, and the respect of the law. But somewhere along the way they figured that robbing people seemed more lucrative than protecting them. The irony probably kept them awake at night. Or maybe they just had the same difficulty with regular employment that a lot of people do, except they handled it by becoming train robbers. It's not a recommended career pivot, but it happened. The gang started hitting trains in 1891, and for a while they were actually pretty successful. They operated in California, and the frontier press ate it up, covering their exploits with the kind of breathless enthusiasm that made them folk heroes to some people. You know how it is. There's always something glamorous about the outlaw life when you're reading about it from a safe distance, preferably from your own bed with no criminal intentions whatsoever. But here's where it gets interesting. By 1892, the Daltons decided they were going to pull off something bold, something legendary, something that would cement their place in history. They were going to rob not one bank, but two banks at the same time, in the same town, Coffeyville, Kansas. Yes, that's right. While other criminals were learning the value of operating discreetly, the Daltons decided to test Newton's laws of motion and common sense in one spectacular afternoon. October 5th, 1892. You're trying to imagine this scenario. The town isn't huge, maybe a couple thousand people, and there are these outlaws just riding in, splitting up into groups and calmly walking into the First National Bank and the CM Condon Bank. They figure they'll just grab the cash, ride back out, and nobody will be able to stop them. Except for one minor problem. Several citizens of Coffeyville recognized them. Just like that, the secret was out. What followed next is one of those moments in Old West history that dispelled any remaining romanticism about gunfights. This wasn't a dramatic duel at high noon. This was a chaotic street battle between a few outlaws and an increasingly angry mob of townspeople who were absolutely not interested in being robbed. The gunfight lasted barely 15 minutes, but it was absolutely devastating. 4 citizens died. 2 of the Dalton brothers, Bob and Grat, were killed. Frank Dalton was badly wounded. Emmett survived, but just barely, and he was captured. The whole thing was a catastrophic failure wrapped up in minutes. Here's a quirky tidbit that historians love to mention. There's actually a photograph of the Dalton gang's corpses laid out in Coffeyville, and copies of it were sold as souvenirs. You can still find those images today, which is simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling. The frontier loved its morbid memorabilia. The mainstream historical takeaway here is that the Dalton gang represented the tail end of the Old West outlaws. This wasn't the 1870s anymore. By 1892, the frontier was becoming more settled, more connected by telegraph, more populated by people who would actually fight back. The days when a small gang of outlaws could terrorize an entire region were waning. Coffeyville was proof of that, and it happened fast. Historians still argue whether the Daltons deliberately chose Coffeyville because they had family connections there and thought they'd get a pass, or if they were just supremely overconfident. Either way, it's a good reminder that even when you're planning something, sometimes reality has different ideas. Emmett Dalton survived and eventually wrote a book about his experiences, becoming something of a dime novel celebrity himself, which is perhaps the most ironic ending possible for an outlaw. As you're settling deeper into your pillow, consider this. The Dalton gang wanted to be remembered as legendary outlaws, and they did get remembered. Just not for reasons they probably hoped for. They became the object lesson of how not to commit crimes in an increasingly civilized America. Your eyes are getting heavier now, and we're shifting focus a bit. For the entire time we've been talking about outlaws in the 1800s, you might have noticed something. We've mostly been talking about men. Butch Cassidy, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, the Daltons. All male names. All male exploits. But crime, like everything else in America, didn't care much about gender boundaries. And there were women who rode out into the frontier and became just as notorious, just as brutal, and just as fascinating as their male counterparts. So settle in, because Belle Starr is about to ride into your consciousness, and she's not going to leave quietly. Belle Starr wasn't born into crime. She was Myra Maybelle Shirley, daughter of a Missouri farmer and hotel owner, and she had a perfectly respectable upbringing. But somewhere along the way, she fell in with Cole Younger of the Younger James gang. You remember them, don't you? The criminal associates of the James family. That romantic entanglement pulled her into a world of outlaws and adventure, and once she got a taste of that life, turning back became increasingly difficult. Belle Starr's specialty was horse theft. Not just stealing one horse here or there, but operating a full-scale horse theft empire in Indian Territory, which is what Oklahoma was called back then. She'd acquire horses, sometimes through theft, sometimes through more legitimate-seeming means, and then sell them to other outlaws who needed fresh mounts for their own criminal operations. She was essentially running a used horse dealership for the criminal element, which is actually kind of brilliant when you think about it. Nobody buys a car from a dealership and asks too many questions about where that car came from, and the same principle applied to horse trading in the 1870s and 1880s. You're almost admiring the business model while also acknowledging that it was definitely illegal. What's remarkable about Belle Starr is that she didn't hide. She was famous. Newspapers wrote about her. The Dallas Morning News called her the Bandit Queen, and the name stuck. She dressed distinctively, often wearing a black velvet dress and a feathered hat, which is exactly what you would not wear if your goal was to avoid recognition. But Belle had moved past caring about discretion. She was embracing her notoriety, cultivating it, using it. In some ways, she was one of the first American celebrities, a woman famous for being famous, though instead of social media, she had newspaper sensationalism. But Belle wasn't alone in the outlaw world. Pearl Hart was another woman who chose crime over convention, though her method was different. In May 1899, Pearl and a male accomplice stopped a stagecoach on a mountain road in Arizona and robbed the passengers. By all accounts, Pearl was cool under pressure, professional, and she got away with the money. for a hot minute anyway, until she was tracked down, captured and convicted. But here's the twist. She became an instant celebrity too. Suddenly there were photographs of her in papers across the country. She got fan mail from admirers across America. She became an object of fascination precisely because she had done something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Women weren't supposed to be stagecoach robbers. Pearl Hart had crossed a line that society had very firmly drawn. Then you had Cattle Annie and Little Britches. Those were nicknames for Annie MacDougall and Jenny Stevens, two teenagers who got caught up in the outlaw world in Indian Territory. They ran with the horse thieves and cattle rustlers, and they became legendary for their riding ability and their willingness to participate in criminal enterprises. They were teenagers when they became notorious, which means they were caught in that peculiar space of being young enough to be sympathetic but old enough to be dangerous. The newspapers of the time had a field day with the scandal of it all. Young women, crime, moral decay. The red light newspapers fed on stories like this. Here's a quirky tidbit that historians genuinely debate. Belle Starr was allegedly murdered by someone on her own property in 1889, and to this day nobody knows who killed her. Her husband was investigated. Neighbours were questioned. The case was never solved. Some historians wonder if it was a romantic jealousy situation. Others think it might have been a business rival. It's one of those Old West mysteries that never got answered, and that uncertainty only adds to Belle's legend. The mainstream historical fact you should remember is this. These women outlaws weren't anomalies. They were part of a broader pattern of women in the frontier West who refused traditional gender roles. Some of them became saloon operators or ranchers or business owners. Some, like Belle Starr and Pearl Hart, chose the outlaw route. But all of them represented a kind of freedom that women back east couldn't access. In Indian Territory and the western frontier, there was enough chaos and instability that traditional gender hierarchies became more flexible. It wasn't enlightenment or progressive thinking. It was just practical. You needed people to work, and if a woman could do the job, a frontier community was more likely to let her do it. Historians still argue whether Belle Starr was a genuine criminal mastermind, or if the newspapers sensationalized her exploits to create a more interesting story than the reality. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. She did engage in crime, she did run a horse theft operation. But she was also a woman whose legend was deliberately amplified by the press for maximum dramatic effect. As your body relaxes further into the mattress, consider that these women outlaws weren't desperately seeking freedom. Some of them were, but many of them just ended up in criminal situations because they loved adventure, or because they fell in with the wrong people, or because the frontier economy offered few legitimate opportunities for women. They were products of their time, making choices that made sense in their context, even if those choices led to notoriety and in many cases imprisonment or death. You're deeper into sleep now, your breathing slowing, and we're about to talk about something that made the frontier towns actually run. Not law and order, not agriculture or industry, vice, gambling, drinking, prostitution, drug use, opium dens, saloons, brothels, all the things that respectable Victorian society was supposed to abhor, but that every frontier town seemed to depend on for economic survival. It's an uncomfortable contradiction that historians sometimes gloss over, but the reality is this. The vice economies of the frontier West were what actually funded civic development. Let's start with Dodge City, Kansas, because Dodge City understood something fundamental about making money. Yes, it was a cattle town. Yes, it was famous for gunfights and frontier law enforcement. But what really made Dodge City wealthy was the Long Branch Saloon and everything it represented. When the cattle drives came through, they brought cowboys who were young, male, far from home, and loaded with money they'd just earned on the trail. Those cowboys wanted food, alcohol, and companionship. Dodge City said, "We can provide all of that," and it did so with gusto. The Long Branch wasn't just a saloon. It was a multi-purpose establishment. You could drink whiskey there. You could gamble. There were rooms upstairs where you could spend time with women. There were poker games that sometimes involved substantial sums of money. The saloon was a one-stop shop for every vice a frontier traveller could want. The profits were astronomical. A single cattle drive could bring thousands of cowboys through town, and many of them would spend months' worth of wages in a single evening. For the owners and the city itself, this was incredibly lucrative. But here's what made it truly interesting. The city leadership in Dodge City understood that they needed to manage the vice economy, not eliminate it. They couldn't prevent gambling and prostitution, So instead, they taxed it, regulated it, and turned it into a municipal revenue stream. Prostitutes had to pay licenses. Gambling houses had to operate within certain boundaries. The city hired lawmen to make sure the vice stayed relatively organised and didn't spill over into complete chaos. It was a pragmatic approach to an impossible situation, and it worked. Deadwood, South Dakota, had a similar economy. It boomed during the gold rush, and much of that boom was fueled by brothels. Deadwood became famous for its red light district, and that district became famous for the quality of accommodations and the discretion of the operations. The brothels of Deadwood were legendary, and they were also relatively well organised. The city government turned a blind eye to them, officially. Unofficially, they were taxed and regulated just like any other business. The prostitution industry gave Deadwood stability and revenue that allowed it to develop actual infrastructure. You had schools, churches, and civic institutions all funded in part by money that had come through the vice economy. Then you had opium dens, which were particularly associated with Chinese immigrant communities. San Francisco had a famous network of opium dens in its Chinese quarter, and many other western cities had them too. Opium use was not illegal in America until 1906, so these establishments operated openly. They were social spaces. They were businesses. They were also deeply tied to the exploitation of Chinese immigrant labour and the development of organised crime networks that would eventually become the Tongs. But during the 1800s, opium dens were just another part of the vice economy that kept frontier cities running. Here's a quirky historical fact that doesn't get discussed enough. In many frontier towns, the prostitution industry was actually one of the most reliable sources of tax revenue. Some towns had official red light districts where brothels were concentrated, taxed and regulated. The proprietresses, and many brothels were run by women, paid fees to the city. The workers paid fees or had portions of their earnings taken as taxes. From the city's perspective, this was a self-regulating system. You had an industry that was profitable, visible, and that could be taxed without requiring police to do much more than maintain basic order. The mainstream historical fact is this: vice economies were instrumental in the development of the American West. That's not comfortable for some people to acknowledge, but it's true. The wealth generated by saloons, gambling and brothels didn't just enrich individual entrepreneurs. It provided seed capital for the development of legitimate businesses. It funded civic infrastructure. It allowed frontier towns to grow into actual cities. Without the vice economy, many Western communities would have remained tiny and fragile. With it, they had the resources to diversify their economic base and eventually transition into more respectable ventures. Historians still argue whether the relationship between vice and civic growth was necessary, or whether it was something that frontier societies simply chose because it was easy. The debate centres on whether you can build a sustainable society with a vice economy at its foundation, and whether the exploitation inherent in that economy is a bug or a feature of how the frontier developed. What's clear is that the relationship existed, and it was more integrated into official city governance than respectable society wanted to admit. As you're drifting deeper, barely awake now, consider that the nice Victorian world, with its proper ladies and gentlemen, was only possible because somewhere else, usually on the frontier, there were people engaging in vice that funded development. The respectability of the East was built partly on the sin of the West. Pretty wild to contemplate when you're supposed to be falling asleep, but it's the kind of historical irony that tends to stick with you. Your mind is getting fuzzy now, thoughts stretching out and becoming dreamlike, and we're heading back east for a bit. We've spent a lot of time in the frontier west, the wide open spaces, the lone outlaws, the dramatic gunfights. But crime in America didn't start in the west, it was in the cities. Specifically in the teeming, crowded, desperate slums where immigrants arrived with nothing and had to build lives from scratch. Welcome to the 5 Points neighbourhood of New York City, where organised crime essentially invented itself. The 5 Points got its name from the intersection of 5 streets in Lower Manhattan, though it's better understood as a neighbourhood where around 50,000 people lived in conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. We're talking about the 1820s through 1860s. Tenement buildings were stacked with families. Sanitation was non-existent. Employment opportunities were scarce. The neighbourhood was predominantly Irish and black, which meant it was an ethnic community that faced deliberate discrimination from the more established Anglo-Saxon population. In that crucible of poverty, crime became an alternative economy. It became a way of life. It became, for some, the only way up. The gangs that emerged from the 5 Points were unlike anything you'd see on the frontier. They were organised, they were numerous, and they claimed territory. The most famous were probably the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys. The Dead Rabbits were primarily Irish. The Bowery Boys were primarily Anglo-Saxon or German. They had territorial disputes, they had alliances, they had hierarchies. When they fought, it wasn't a couple of guys at high noon. It was mass brawls involving hundreds of people, often lasting for hours. The draft riots of 1863 grew partly out of gang violence that had been building for decades. What made these gangs different from frontier outlaws is that they operated inside cities that actually had law enforcement, city government, and civic institutions. They couldn't just rob a bank and ride away. They had to operate with some degree of protection, which meant they had to corrupt officials, make deals with politicians, and develop relationships with the people who actually ran the city. This is the birth of organised crime in America. This is the moment when criminals stopped being individual actors and became organisations with structure, hierarchy and political power. The Wyos were another famous gang, and they came later, 1860s and 1870s. They're notable because they created what might be the first criminal price list in American history. They had a menu. If you wanted someone punched, that cost a certain amount. If you wanted someone stabbed, that cost more. If you wanted someone murdered, that was the premium service. It's grim, obviously, but it also shows a kind of business organisation that the frontier outlaws never achieved. The Wyos understood themselves as a service industry. You had a problem, they had a solution, and there was a price associated with that solution. Immigrant gang culture became a pipeline for American organised crime. Young men, Irish, Italian, Jewish, arrived in America with nothing, faced discrimination, and found that criminal enterprises offered a way to organise themselves, develop power, and make money. The skills learned in street gangs transferred easily into organised crime. The networks established in the 5 Points and similar neighbourhoods became the foundation for the criminal syndicates that would dominate urban America in the 20th century. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Dead Rabbits gang got its name because at one of their meetings, someone threw a dead rabbit on the table, and rather than being disgusted, they took it as a rallying symbol. That's either the most ridiculous or the most badass origin story imaginable, and historians genuinely disagree about which. The gang adopted the dead rabbit as their emblem, and they painted it on buildings and wore it on their clothing. It became a symbol of gang identity, which seems absurd until you remember that gang identity is partly about asserting presence and claiming territory. The dead rabbit said, "We were here. This is our neighbourhood." The mainstream historical fact is that American organised crime emerged from the streets of New York and other eastern cities, not from the frontier. The 5 Points and neighbourhoods like it were laboratories for developing the organisational structures that would later become Tammany Hall's political machine, the Mafia, and other criminal syndicates. The frontier outlaws were romantic figures, but the city gang members were the actual architects of organised crime as an institution. They developed hierarchies, they created corruption networks, they learned how to work with politicians. By the time the frontier was being settled, the fundamental structures of organised crime were already established in eastern cities. Historians still argue whether gang violence in the 5 Points was a product of poverty and discrimination, or whether it was a deliberate choice made by young men who saw crime as a path to status and respect. The answer almost certainly is both. Poverty created the conditions where crime became possible, but discrimination and limited legitimate opportunities made crime attractive. And once crime became a viable path, it became self-perpetuating. Young men saw older gang members with money and power and status, and they wanted that. So they joined gangs, they committed crimes, and the cycle continued. As your awareness is narrowing to just the feeling of the pillow beneath your head and the blanket covering your body, understand that the gangs of the 5 Points were creating something that would outlast them by centuries. They were building the infrastructure for American organised crime. They were developing the relationships with politicians that would corrupt city government for generations. They were teaching lessons about how to organise violence, manage territory and corrupt institutions. In some ways, the Dead Rabbits and the Wyos had far more impact on American history than any individual frontier outlaw could have achieved. The frontier was dramatic. The cities were strategic. You're almost fully asleep now, your thoughts barely coherent, existing in that beautiful space between waking and dreaming where everything feels slightly surreal and deeply comfortable. This is the perfect time to talk about counterfeiters and con artists, because the more you learn about them, the more unreal everything seems. These weren't violent criminals, these were criminals who succeeded through gullibility, creativity, and an almost admirable audacity. They were the hustlers, the swindlers, the con men who understood that in America, if you could talk well and print fast, you could make a fortune. Let's talk about money for a moment. This is important context. In the 1800s, there wasn't a single unified American currency that everyone used. What you had instead was a confusing nightmare of different banknotes issued by hundreds of different banks. Each bank printed its own currency. Each note looked different. Some banks were stable and trustworthy. Other banks were fly-by-night operations that would vanish overnight after issuing notes they had no intention of honouring. If you were a merchant in Kansas and someone handed you a banknote from a small bank in Maine, how would you even know if it was real? You probably wouldn't. This was the counterfeiter's dream scenario. Counterfeiting became a massive industry in the 1800s. We're not talking about a few criminals printing fake money in basements. We're talking about large operations, sometimes with dozens of employees using sophisticated printing equipment to produce counterfeit notes that were often better quality than the legitimate notes they were copying. The notes circulated through the economy so widely that it became almost impossible to detect all of them. Estimates suggest that at the peak of counterfeiting in America, nearly 1/3 of all currency in circulation was fake. 1/3. That's not a bug in the system. That's a feature that criminals had successfully weaponized. The counterfeiting trade had a whole hierarchy and organization to it. You had master counterfeiters who designed the notes and oversaw production. You had workers who actually did the printing. You had distributors who got the fake money into circulation. And you had financiers, people who would exchange counterfeit notes for real ones, taking a cut for their trouble. These operations were sometimes run out of legitimate printing shops. Sometimes they operated from rural areas far from law enforcement. Some of them were so sophisticated that they had agents in multiple cities, coordinating distribution of their products like a legitimate business would. Then you had the green goods scam, which was a confidence game built on counterfeiting. A con man would approach someone and claim he had access to counterfeit currency at a discount. He'd show the mark some samples, beautiful counterfeits, practically perfect. He'd offer to sell a large quantity at, say, 50 cents on the dollar. All the mark had to do was pay a deposit, usually a substantial one, and deliver it to a specific location. The mark would show up, hand over money, take the envelope of counterfeit bills and feel like they'd just made a brilliant deal, until they tried to use the money and discovered it was fake. But by then, the con man was gone, and the mark was both out the deposit money and holding counterfeit currency they couldn't use. The genius of the green goods scam is that it exploited people's greed and their willingness to break the law. You had to want to buy counterfeit money to fall for the scam. You had to be willing to participate in an illegal transaction. So when you got caught, you had no legal recourse. You couldn't go to the police and say, "I got scammed trying to buy counterfeit money." You were a criminal. You had no protection. This is why the con men who ran this scam were so successful for so long. Their victims couldn't report them. Enter Soapy Smith. Now here's a name that deserves attention. Jefferson Randolph Smith, known as Soapy Smith, was a con artist of legendary proportions. He operated primarily in Leadville, Colorado, and later in Denver and Skagway, Alaska. His name came from one of his most famous scams. He'd sell bars of soap that supposedly contained gold nuggets. He'd sell them to crowds at a discount, and he'd even demonstrate by opening a bar, pulling out a gold nugget and pocketing it. Marks would buy bars, open them excitedly, and find nothing but soap. But Soapy had accomplices in the crowd, shills, who would seemingly open bars and find gold. Of course they did. Soapy had paid them to do it. The whole thing was theatre, and it worked repeatedly because people want to believe in luck. But the soap scam was just the beginning. Soapy ran all sorts of con operations. He set up fake telegraph offices where people would send money for various purposes, and it would disappear. He ran shell games and confidence tricks. He had an organisation around him, employees, accomplices, corrupt officials who looked the other way. At his peak, Soapy Smith controlled a significant portion of the underground economy in Colorado and Alaska. He was essentially running an organised crime operation, but his crime was confidence tricks rather than violence. Here's a quirky historical fact that reveals something about American society. People knew about the green goods scams. There were newspaper articles warning people about them. Legitimate authorities issued alerts, and yet the scams continued to work, sometimes for decades. Why? Because there were always new marks. There were always people who thought they could get rich quick, who thought they were smarter than the con artists, who thought they could pull off an illegal transaction without getting caught. Human nature is remarkably constant. Greed and overconfidence remain powerful motivators. The mainstream historical fact is that counterfeiting and confidence games were so prevalent in 1800s America that they essentially created a shadow economy. The legitimate economy existed, but running parallel to it was a massive criminal economy dedicated to separating people from their money. This wasn't a bug. This was baked into how American commerce worked. People exchanged goods knowing that some percentage of the money changing hands was counterfeit. Merchants had sophisticated methods for detecting bad notes. Entire businesses were built around identifying and removing counterfeits from circulation. The whole system adapted to accommodate a level of fraud that would be absolutely unthinkable today. Historians still argue whether the counterfeiting and confidence games of the 1800s were a form of class warfare, criminals stealing from the rich, or whether they were simply opportunistic criminals taking advantage of a poorly regulated financial system. The reality is probably some of both. Con men targeted marks they thought had money. Counterfeiters operated because the financial system made it possible. But there's also something almost admirable about the audacity of it. These criminals weren't murdering people. They were using intelligence, charm, and creativity to take money from people who wanted to participate in illegal transactions. In a strange way, they were running a business, just an illegal one. As you're slipping into sleep now, barely able to keep your eyes open, consider this. The 1800s didn't have credit cards or digital transactions. Everything was physical. Cash was king. And in that world, where physical currency was the medium of exchange, criminals figured out how to manufacture it, distribute it, and profit from it on a massive scale. They'd be fascinated and horrified by modern digital fraud, probably. But the principle remains the same. Wherever there's money and people wanting to make more of it without working for it, you'll find con artists and counterfeiters. It's as much a part of American economic history as steel mills and railroads, just less respectable and infinitely more interesting. You're drifting now through the era of the great detective agencies, and if Jesse James and Butch Cassidy were the desperate poets of American crime, then Alan Pinkerton was the accountant who decided to ruin their verse. The man started humble. Born in Glasgow in 1819, he emigrated to America and took work as a barrel maker in Chicago. But barrels didn't speak to his ambitions. One day in 1847, while cutting wood, he stumbled onto counterfeiters operating in the forest, and something clicked. Here was a puzzle, a mystery, a chance to use his wits instead of his hands. He reported them to the authorities, got deputized, and never looked back. Within a few years, Pinkerton had founded the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and he would spend the next several decades turning it into the closest thing America had ever seen to a private secret police. His motto was simple and delightfully ominous: "We never sleep." The company's logo was a sleepless eye, yes, the actual origin of the term private eye, and Pinkerton's men became legendary for their tenacity, their spy networks, and their complete disregard for small details like legal jurisdiction. They were brilliant in their way. Pinkerton pioneered forensic techniques decades before the FBI existed. His operatives used photography, coded messages, and vast networks of informants to track America's most wanted criminals. They pursued Jesse James and his gang relentlessly across state lines, setting up sting operations and following leads into the darkest corners of the frontier. When you read accounts of the James family during the 1870s, the constant raids on their Missouri safe house, the spies posing as hired hands, the letters being intercepted, that was largely Pinkerton's handiwork. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable, the kind of discomfort that keeps historians awake at night. The Pinkertons weren't just detectives. They were also union busters, strike breakers, and industrial enforcers for railroad barons and mining magnates. You have to understand, in the decades after the Civil War, labor movements exploded across America. Workers were exhausted, underpaid, and increasingly angry. When they struck, when they organized, when they began to resist the brutal conditions of industrial capitalism, the Pinkertons were there to stop them, sometimes with clubs, sometimes with guns. The most notorious incident was the Homestead Strike of 1892, when 300 Pinkerton agents descended on a steel mill in Pennsylvania where workers were protesting wage cuts. What followed was essentially a battle. Shots were fired, people died, and it became clear that the Pinkertons operated in a grey zone where the difference between law enforcement and hired muscle had almost completely vanished. Then there were the Molly Maguires. This was a secret society of Irish-American miners in Pennsylvania, angry about conditions in the anthracite coalfields, and they resorted to violence, sabotage, intimidation, even murder to pressure the companies. The Pinkerton agency planted a spy named James McParland deep inside the group. For years, McParland lived among them, gained their trust, and reported back everything. He was so convincing that he participated in violent acts himself. The information he gathered led to the arrest and execution of several Molly Maguires, and while the Labour historians might argue about whether the group deserved what it got, there's no question that McParland's infiltration was morally murky. He wasn't just investigating, he was actively shaping events from the inside. Historians still argue whether McParland was a courageous undercover operative or a provocateur who helped manufacture the very violence he was sent to stop. The whole agency embodied a contradiction that would define American law enforcement for a century to come. They were simultaneously defenders of order and agents of particular interests. Alan Pinkerton died in 1884, but his agency continued, eventually becoming so powerful and so controversial that Congress would regulate private detective work because of them. They caught real criminals, yes, but they also protected killers when it was profitable, worked to suppress legitimate protest, and blurred the line between detective work and industrial terrorism. When you look at the later evolution of American policing, how police unions often oppose reform, how law enforcement can become an instrument of corporate interests, you can draw a line back to the Pinkertons and their vision of law enforcement as a service you buy, not a public good you build. The real genius of Pinkerton, though, was his marketing. He published books about his cases. He became a celebrity detective in an era when detective work was still exotic and mysterious. The stories of his operatives tracking criminals across continents, using codes and disguises, infiltrating criminal gangs, these fed America's hunger for detective fiction. When Arthur Conan Doyle was writing Sherlock Holmes in London, he was partly inspired by the real detective stories coming out of America. Pinkerton was the original influencer, turning his agency's work into legend, making crime fighting glamorous. By the time he died, there were Pinkerton detective novels being read across America, and the public barely distinguished between the real cases and the embellished ones. It was brilliant branding, really. The kind of thing that would make a modern marketing executive weep with envy. You trudge westward now, away from the urban crime and industrial violence of the East, toward a place that existed in a strange legal limbo. Fort Smith, Arkansas, sitting at the edge of Indian Territory like an outpost at the end of the world. This is where you meet Isaac Parker, and you need to understand that Parker was not a villain. He believed utterly in his righteousness, but he was also one of the most powerful men in American criminal justice, answerable to almost no one, presiding over a court where the sentence for stealing a horse could be death. Fort Smith was the gateway. Everything west of it, into what is now Oklahoma, was Indian Territory, land theoretically governed by Native American nations but increasingly infiltrated by white outlaws, fugitives, and those who wanted to disappear from the reach of civilized law. Parker became a federal judge in 1875, and he arrived with the conviction that the frontier needed an iron fist. The previous administration had been lenient, chaotic, relatively toothless. Parker looked at the crime flowing out of Indian Territory, murders, robberies, rape, and decided that hesitation was a form of complicity. He would hold court with an efficiency that borders on the industrial. During his 21 years on the bench, Parker sentenced 160 people to death. 160. Think about that number rolling past you in the darkness. That's not a judge. That's an execution machine operated by a man in a robe. And here's the thing. He was popular. Westerners loved him. Newspapers called him the hanging judge with something approaching affection. In the mythology that grew up around Fort Smith, Parker became a hero, a voice of justice in chaos, a man who restored order through sheer force of will. The infrastructure of his court was remarkable. Parker employed scores of deputy marshals, men who would ride into Indian Territory, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, armed with federal warrants, tasked with bringing back fugitives from a wilderness where local law meant almost nothing. These men were underpaid, under-equipped, and extraordinarily brave, or extraordinarily reckless, depending on your perspective. They would disappear into the nations for weeks or months, tracking down murderers across ravines and rivers, through weather that could kill you as surely as a bullet. Some came back with prisoners, some didn't come back at all. You can read the casualty lists if you want to feel depressed. Deputy marshals shot in ambushes, drowned crossing swollen rivers, hanged by lynch mobs, killed by outlaws they were chasing. There was a romantic quality to their work, the lone lawman riding into danger, but the reality was closer to organised butchery. For every famous outlaw they caught, 2 deputies died unnamed and unremarked. Parker's Court had its own theatre. The trials would be held in the courtroom at Fort Smith, and they were public spectacles. Prisoners would be brought to trial, evidence would be presented, often hastily, and Parker would deliver his verdicts in statements that combined legal argument with moral pronouncements. He had a voice for it, apparently, and a talent for the dramatic. When he sentenced someone to death, he would sometimes take time to explain their moral failings, to address them directly, to make their coming execution seem not just legal, but deserved, necessary, righteous. There's a cruelty to that kind of judicial theatre, a way it dehumanises the condemned by turning their death into a moral lesson. But contemporary accounts describe it as compelling, almost hypnotic. The problem is that speed and finality don't equal justice. Historians still argue whether Parker's Court actually protected the frontier, or simply imposed a blanket of legalised violence that happened to wear the robes of an actual judge. There were definitely guilty people he executed. Jesse the Outlaw was tried in Parker's Court, along with numerous murderers and thieves who genuinely deserved severe punishment. But there were also questionable convictions, death sentences handed down based on thin evidence. Native Americans tried in Parker's Court for crimes that occurred in Indian Territory and arguably fell under tribal jurisdiction. There's a sense, when you read about his trials, that Parker was less interested in perfect justice than in perfect order, that someone had to die to maintain the peace, and it mattered less who that someone was as long as the example was made. Parker himself believed he was serving God. He was deeply religious, and he wrote about his death sentences as though they were a form of divine punishment administered through his hand. In his mind, he wasn't a man killing human beings, he was an instrument of justice, perhaps even of divine retribution. That kind of conviction is terrifying because it removes doubt, and justice without doubt is just ideology with a death penalty attached. When Parker died in 1896, still a judge, Fort Smith mourned. The newspapers called him a hero. The deputy marshals who served under him became legends, and their stories were told and retold until the distinction between fact and myth became impossible to locate. There's a statue of Parker in Fort Smith now, standing in judgment, his face stern and confident, and most people who see it probably have no idea that this man ordered the execution of 160 people. Or if they do know, they've been taught to see it as righteous. You're moving deeper now into a terrain that's even more morally complex, where the categories you've been using all night, criminal and lawman, guilty and innocent, start to dissolve like sugar in rain. Because you need to talk about the people who lived in Indian Territory, the ones who resisted federal authority, and whose resistance got classified as crime. This isn't simple. Nothing about it is simple. Start with Ned Christie. He was Cherokee, born in 1852 in Indian Territory, and he lived during the period when the Cherokee Nation was becoming increasingly unable to govern itself, when federal authority was creeping in like fog. In 1887, a man was killed in Fort Gibson, a federal officer named Dan Maples. The blame fell on Ned Christie. Whether he actually did it is one of those historical questions that probably has no definitive answer, but what matters is that a federal warrant was issued, and a deputy marshal was sent to arrest him. Christie resisted, and from that moment on, he was transformed into what the federal system could recognise, an outlaw. What followed was a siege. Christie barricaded himself in his home. Deputy marshals came to arrest him, and Christie shot at them from his cabin. The marshals came back with reinforcements. There were multiple firefights. In one account, the federal forces actually brought a small cannon to blow down Christie's cabin. Can you imagine that? A cannon against a single Cherokee man in his own home. The violence escalated across years, and each escalation pushed Christie further into the role of outlaw, until finally, In 1892, he was captured and brought to Isaac Parker's court, where he was sentenced to death and executed. The version of this story that survives in the history books often treats Christie as a criminal who resisted arrest. But look at it from a different angle. Here was a Cherokee man in Cherokee territory, accused of a crime, hunted by federal agents, his home besieged, treated not as a person deserving due process, but as an enemy combatant. If Ned Christie's real crime was resisting federal jurisdiction, then the fact that he was labelled an outlaw says something uncomfortable about the entire system. It means that indigenous resistance to American authority became criminalised, that the law was the tool that turned national sovereignty into felony. Then there was Cherokee Bill, another resistant figure, though his story is murkier. Bill was part Cherokee, part African-American, born around 1876, and he participated in robberies and murders in Indian Territory. He shot people. He stole. By any standard, he committed crimes. But Cherokee Bill wasn't simply a criminal in a vacuum. He was a young man operating in Indian Territory at a moment when the entire political order was collapsing, when the Cherokee Nation's authority was being eroded by federal encroachment, when young men with no legitimate path to power or respect might turn to violence as a way to assert themselves. That doesn't excuse his murders, but it contextualizes them, and context is the thing that gets stripped away when you turn someone into a legend or a cautionary tale. Historians still argue whether the deputy marshals and federal judges operating in Indian Territory were law enforcers bringing civilization to a lawless frontier, or occupying forces using the language of law to suppress indigenous sovereignty and consolidate American power. The answer is probably that they were both simultaneously, and the tension between those two realities is what makes this history so painful to read. The law is supposed to be neutral, but there's nothing neutral about a legal system designed by and for a foreign power occupying your homeland. The other thing to understand is that Indian Territory attracted fugitives from elsewhere, white outlaws, black outlaws, men fleeing justice in Arkansas or Texas or Missouri. Some of these men formed coalitions with indigenous people. Some were adopted into tribes, some simply disappeared into the landscape. Fort Smith represented the attempt to control this chaos, to extend American jurisdiction into a space that was supposed to be sovereign. Every criminal Parker hanged, every outlaw the deputy marshals brought in, was in some sense an assertion of American authority over Indian Territory. The criminalization of resistance, the transformation of political opposition into felony, the use of law to consolidate dominance. This is what justice looked like when viewed from below. You think about all the people earlier in this story, Frank and Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, Billy the Kid, and they were rebels against authority in various ways, but they were always white. The system might hunt them, might kill them, but it would eventually transform them into legends, into romantic figures whose defiance became culturally valued. But when Ned Christie resisted, when Cherokee Bill committed murders, they were simply criminals, and when they died, they stayed dead, without the benefit of mythologization. That's the privilege embedded in the history of American outlaws. Some rebels get to become heroes, and some just get executed. You're approaching the final chapter now, exhausted but still awake, listening to the sound of a frontier that's closing down like a store at the end of the day. It's the 1890s and something seismic is happening. The Oklahoma land runs, starting in 1889, the government began opening up parcels of Indian Territory to white settlement. Thousands of people would line up at a starting line, and when the gun fired, they would race to claim free land. You can see them in photographs, settlers pressing forward on horseback and on foot, the frontier supposedly opening up one more time, one last time. But it wasn't really a frontier anymore. It was a managed process, a government distribution of resources, and within a few years, Indian Territory would cease to exist as a political entity. The transformation was bureaucratic rather than violent, but it was violent anyway. The outlaws who had survived in Indian Territory, men like Bill Tillman and the group that became known as the Three Guardsmen, found themselves increasingly obsolete. Tillman is interesting because he managed to bridge the old frontier and the new professional law enforcement. He had been a buffalo hunter, a frontier marshal, a deputy in Indian Territory, and he had the skills and reputation of the old school. But as the frontier closed, as Oklahoma became a state in 1907, Tillman reinvented himself. He became a deputy for the new Territorial Marshals Service, but more importantly, he became an actor and filmmaker. He made movies about old frontier tales, starring himself, turning his own life into entertainment. It's a remarkable adaptation, actually. The outlaw hunter becoming a celebrity who performs being an outlaw hunter. The three guardsmen, Tilghman, along with Chris Matheson and Heck Thomas, became legendary figures partly because they operated at that exact moment of transition when the old frontier was dying and the new professional law enforcement was being born. They hunted the last significant outlaw gangs, including Bill Doolin's gang, and they did it with a mixture of frontier tactics and emerging bureaucratic methods. They were the last of their kind, the final representatives of the deputy marshals who rode alone into the wilderness, and the fact that they were successful made them symbols of a closing era. But the real story is about professionalization. The Oklahoma Territory Commission, established in 1901, began organizing law enforcement along modern lines. Training programs, hierarchies, regular salaries, accountability structures. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't always successful, but the idea took root. Law enforcement should be professional, standardized, answerable to established authorities rather than operating out on the frontier as a one-man show. The mythology of the lone lawman, which had always been partly fiction anyway, started to fade, replaced by the mythology of organized institutions. Then came the 1890 census. The Census Bureau announced that the American frontier was closed, that the line of settlement had become so diffused that it no longer existed as a meaningful boundary. This was partly a bureaucratic observation and partly a symbolic statement, but it resonated deeply. The frontier, which had always been more psychological than geographical, was officially over. There was nowhere left to go, no blank space on the map, no place where you could escape civilization and start over. Historians still argue about what this really meant. Did the frontier actually close, or did it just transform into something else? But what's clear is that American self-conception shifted in that moment. The nation had to confront the idea that infinite expansion was no longer possible, that resources were limited, that you couldn't simply move west when things got too crowded. For the outlaw, for the person living outside the law, this was catastrophic. You couldn't disappear anymore. You couldn't ride into the wilderness and vanish. The railroad had connected everything. The telegraph had made communication instantaneous across vast distances. Federal authority was tightening its grip across the entire continent. The bandits who had operated in the 1870s and 1880s had a luxury that was completely unavailable to the younger generation. They had places to hide. By the 1890s, those places were contracting. The frontier was becoming the museum exhibit. Billy the Kid died in 1881. Jesse James died in 1882. Butch Cassidy and Harry Sundance, well, nobody really knows when they died, but they disappeared, likely into Bolivia or perhaps into legend, in the early 1900s. These men were already becoming historical figures by the time the frontier officially closed. They were the last generation of a particular kind of criminal, the bandit operating in the era of expansion, and their successors would face a fundamentally different world. The Oklahoma land runs were meant to open up new territory, but instead they were the final moment of the frontier. Once those lands were claimed, once the map was completely filled in, the outlaws' traditional survival strategy, flight, was no longer viable. You can't run west if there's nowhere west to run to. And so you arrive at the twilight, at the moment when America decided what to do with its criminals and its memory of them. The outlaw age didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whimper and then a marketing campaign. The last significant outlaw gangs were broken up in the first decade of the 20th century. Bill Doolin was shot in 1896. Cherokee Bill was executed in 1896. By 1910, the great era of frontier banditry was over. But something interesting happened in its wake. America fell in love with the memory of it. Buffalo Bill Cody had already been making a fortune off frontier nostalgia, even while the frontier existed. His Wild West show had been touring America and Europe since 1883, turning Indian wars into entertainment, hiring actual famous gunfighters and Native Americans to perform historical reenactments, blurring the line between history and performance so thoroughly that the audience couldn't locate it. When you attended Buffalo Bill's show, you weren't watching the frontier, you were watching a carefully constructed performance of what the frontier meant, edited and enhanced to be more exciting and meaningful than the real thing. Buffalo Bill died in 1917, but the machine he had created, the transformation of frontier history into entertainment, of outlaws into characters, that lived on, Dime novels had been turning outlaws into heroes since the 1870s. They were cheap, sensational, often wildly inaccurate, and the public couldn't get enough of them. Jesse James became a folk hero through the pages of dime novels before he was even dead. Billy the Kid's legend grew primarily through these cheap publications rather than through actual knowledge of who he was or what he did. The novels transformed real people into archetypes. The noble outlaw, the courageous bandit, the hero who stood against injustice. These weren't subtle retellings, they were complete mythifications, taking human beings and turning them into symbols. Then came the movies. The first film about a famous outlaw was made in 1903. The Great Train Robbery, which dramatised a real robbery, but transformed it into a morality play, complete with a violent ending that satisfied the audience's need for justice. As the technology advanced, as movies became longer and more sophisticated, the Western, a new genre entirely, emerged, and it took the history of the frontier and turned it into a story about good and evil, civilization and wilderness, progress and resistance. The real Butch Cassidy was a bank robber. The movie Butch Cassidy was a charming anti-hero, complex and sympathetic, played by Paul Newman in 1969, a rebel against authority in an era when rebellion was culturally valued. Here's what American culture did. It took people who were, in many cases, actual murderers, and it transformed them into legends. This wasn't dishonest exactly, but it wasn't honest either. It was a particular kind of forgetting, a way of processing difficult history by aestheticizing it, by turning blood into narrative, by making the frontier romantic. The real Jesse James was a Confederate guerrilla who became a criminal, a man who killed people, including women and children in some cases. But the legend of Jesse James became about a wronged Southerner standing against Northern oppression, a folk hero, someone whose crimes were recontextualized as acts of resistance. You have to ask yourself, why? Why did America need to mythologize these criminals? Why was it important that they become legends rather than simply cautionary tales? And the answer has something to do with how America understood itself. The frontier, even as it was closing, represented possibility. It represented a space where you could reinvent yourself, where the rules of civilization didn't apply, where individualism could flourish. The outlaws in this story became the last representatives of that frontier spirit, the last of the individualists standing against the encroaching machinery of the state. They lost, of course. That's the crucial part of the story. They had to lose for the narrative to work. They had to be defeated so that progress could triumph. But in losing, they became tragic figures, and tragic figures are always more compelling than mere criminals. Historians still argue about whether this mythology is harmful or healthy, whether it romanticizes crime or whether it serves a necessary psychological function, allowing Americans to process the violence and dispossession that built the nation. The truth is probably both. The mythologization of outlaws allowed Americans to feel nostalgia for the frontier, even as they were glad to be done with actual frontier conditions. It allowed them to celebrate individualism and resistance while living in an increasingly conformist, hierarchical society. It was a way of having it both ways, of preserving the spirit of the frontier in memory, while building the modern nation-state in reality. The dime novels and the Wild West shows and the movies, they weren't lying exactly, but they weren't telling the whole story either. They were selecting, emphasizing, shaping. They were taking raw history and turning it into a commodity, something that could be packaged and sold and consumed. And we've never really stopped doing that. Every Western movie, every novel about the frontier, every myth about the American outlaw is still doing the same work, still selling us a particular vision of the past, still using outlaws and bandits as symbols of something we want to remember about ourselves. The last thing to understand is this. The criminalization of the frontier and the criminalization of resistance to American expansion happened at the same moment. Jesse James was a criminal, yes, but he was also a Missourian resisting federal authority during and after the Civil War. Butch Cassidy was a bank robber, true, but he was also operating in the last spaces where federal authority hadn't yet consolidated complete control. Billy the Kid was a murderer, certainly, but he was also a young man caught between different systems of law and justice in New Mexico. The frontier outlaws were both those things simultaneously, genuine criminals and symbols of something else, and America has never fully resolved that tension. Instead, it chose to remember the symbols while trying to forget the actual crimes. Now, as you listen to these words drifting over you in the darkness, As the long night of history begins to close, you might feel a little sad. The frontier is gone, the outlaws are dead, or lost in legend, or transformed into entertainment. The vast open spaces that once promised freedom and reinvention have been surveyed and divided and claimed and civilized. The world these men lived in is completely gone, replaced by something entirely different. No more wilderness, no more escape, no more possibility of disappearing into the frontier and starting over. What remains is memory and stories and the strange nostalgia we feel for a world that was often brutal and violent and genuinely dangerous, but which we remember as free. But here's the gentle thought to carry with you as you drift away. The frontier may be closed, but that doesn't mean the human need for freedom or the urge to resist authority has gone away. It just transformed. It found new expressions, new outlets, new ways of manifesting in American culture. And perhaps that's the real legacy of the outlaws. Not their crimes, not even their romanticism, but the fact that they represented something in the American character that couldn't be fully contained by law or civilization or authority. That restless, questioning, sometimes destructive impulse to push boundaries and resist control and insist on individual freedom. That didn't die when the frontier closed. It's still here in all of us, in the way we tell stories, in the way we imagine different lives, in the way we dream of spaces where the rules don't apply. So rest now, knowing that the long history of criminal America has brought you to this moment of closure. The Pinkerton detectives are gone, replaced by the FBI and the DEA and all the modern machinery of law enforcement. Isaac Parker's hanging judge court is gone, replaced by something that at least attempts due process. Ned Christie's resistance is memory now, a complicated footnote in the history of Indian Territory. The deputy marshals are gone, replaced by organised police forces and professional training programs. And the outlaws themselves, they've become stories, legends, symbols, the mythic language through which America processes its past. Tomorrow when you wake, the frontier will still be closed, the map will still be filled in, authority will still be comprehensive, reaching into every corner of the nation. But tonight, as you sleep, you can dream of open spaces, of individual men riding into vast wildernesses, of a time when the rules were still being negotiated, when escape was still possible, when the world was still unfinished. And perhaps there's some wisdom in that dream, some truth about human nature that the closed frontier and the professionalized police state can never quite eliminate. Let the images fade now, the dust settling on empty roads, the outlaws disappearing into history, the lights of Fort Smith dimming in the distance. Feel the weight lifting from you, the stories releasing their grip, the long night finally drawing to a close. You can rest now. You've walked through the criminal history of American expansion, from the colonial jails to the frontier to the turning point when the frontier closed and something fundamental changed. It's enough, it's a full night's work. Let it go.